tornou o livro Revolutionary Women in Post-Revolutionary Mexico, em Duke 2005. Ela parte de uma comparação envolvendo 5 regiões do México para demonstrar que as mulheres, conquanto carentes de direitos formais, desempenharam um papel central na construção de uma cidadania revolucionária assentada na experiência de gênero. Ao longo de sua trajetória, o interesse pelo gênero sempre esteve presente, como indicam os inúmeros artigos que publicou tratando do tema em revistas destacadas. Mais do que isso, ao trabalhar o gênero enquanto uma categoria analítica-chave para compreender contextos tão diferentes como a indústria têxtil, as atividades econômicas ilícitas e os movimentos revolucionários, Alcott desafiou pesquisadores de diversos campos a reverem suas certezas, apresentando os paradoxos e os dramas das sociedades latino-americanas a audiências mais amplas. As suas reflexões ganharam a forma de livros, sempre muito bem recebidos. Além da obra resultante da sua tese doutoral, já antes referida, Jocelyn Alcott coeditou com Gabriela Cano e Mary Kay Vaughan o livro Sex in Revolution, Gender, Politics and Power in Modern Mexico, que saiu pela Duke University Press em 2006 e foi traduzido ao espanhol pelo Fundo de Cultura Econômica em 2009. Os ensaios ali reunidos exploraram as maneiras como a Revolução Mexicana abriu espaço para desafiar as restrições de gênero na política, na sociedade e na cultura. Um espaço, entretanto, que cedo foi revertido. Já em International Women's Year, The Greatest Consciousness Raising Event in History, que saiu pela Oxford University Press em 2017, ela se debruçou sobre a Conferência da ONU de 1975, que teve lugar na Cidade do México e se tornou um marco no ativismo feminista global. O livro foi distinguido pela Latin American Studies Association, LASA, com a menção honrosa no prêmio Bryce Wood, além de ter obtido o Ida Blum Karen Often Prize in Transnational Women's and Gender History, concedido pela International Federation for Research in Women's History. Mais recentemente, com Lori Flores, foi responsável pela 4ª edição do The Academic's Handbook, pela Duke University Press em 2020. Nela, mais de 50 colaboradores de uma ampla gama de disciplinas oferecem conselhos práticos para acadêmicos, sejam eles entrando no mercado de trabalho ou lidando com os desafios postos pela carreira docente já em curso. Durante 5 anos, entre 2012 e 2017, Jocelyn foi editora sênior da Hispanic American Historical Review, periódico em que foi responsável em 2011 por organizar um número especial dedicado ao termo da história do trabalho doméstico remunerado e não remunerado na América Latina. Jocelyn Alcott tem tido a atuação destacada em entidades acadêmicas voltadas para os estudos latino-americanos, como a LASA, Latin American Studies Association, e a CLA, Conference on Latin American History, de cujas reuniões participa regularmente, integrando comitês temáticos ou comissões especiais para autórias de premiações. Em seu esforço por interconectar pesquisadores, estimulando o conhecimento de ponta e a formação no campo dos estudos do cuidado, Jocelyn concebeu e coordena uma das mais importantes
studies. Jocelyn conceives and has coordinated one of the most important and vibrant international interdisciplinary network in our field, revaluing care in the global economy, which today mobilizes participants in more than 10 countries around 3 central themes: care metrics, the governance of care policies, and the social practices that inform care. The network articulates initiatives, projects, and even other networks investigating the distribution of care work and the ineffectiveness of traditional solutions to the injustices associated with care. It also assumes the premise of interdependence of social, cultural, and ecological care and the need for innovative solutions beyond conventional approaches to face the care crisis. Their initiatives are multiple, involving seminars, a blog to disseminate findings from working papers, and even the collective assembly for a rich bibliographical base in care studies. Jocelyn is currently working on the biography of Mexican activist and popular singer Concha Michel, a Marxist and former Communist Party activist who became an icon of materialist feminism. At the same time, she is leading the assembly of the 4th meeting of another international network, the Care Work Network, which will take place at Duke University in June. Now let's hear Jocelyn. Thank you.
Are we ready now? Okay, wonderful. Well, first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me here today. I'm going to share my screen here, just so, is that working? There we go. Is the share screen working? Oh, shoot, sorry. For some reason, okay. Okay, so apologies, so many technical challenges. Right, so first of all, I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me today, and for particularly for the honor of being able to share a virtual stage, at least, with Elena Rata, who has influenced so many of us and inspired so much of our work. Since we're already running late, I'm going to go ahead and dive in on the talk, and hopefully we'll still have a little bit of time for conversation at the end. So to start with, in her widely read Testimonio, Let Me Speak, Me Permite Hablar, Domitila Barrios de Jungara, the Bolivian militant who had risen to international prominence during the 1975 International Women's Year Conference in Mexico City, explained to her interlocutor, the Brazilian Mona Vieser, quote, "In spite of everything we do, there's still the idea that women don't work because they don't contribute economically to their home. That only the husband works because he gets a wage." Domitila, as she was widely known, described making a chart of what it would take to pay someone else to perform all of the household labor that fell to her, the laundry, the meal preparation, childcare, cleaning, etc., to show that it added up to several times what her husband earned as a tin miner. She explained, quote, "Even though the state doesn't recognize what we do in the home, the country benefits from it because we don't receive a single penny for this work. And as long as we can continue in the present system, things will always be like this. That's why I think it's so important for us revolutionaries to win that battle within the home." She would later repeat the story to a group of rural women with a possibly apocryphal addition of having engaged in a strike, withholding her domestic labor. Published in 1978 by the socialist publishing house Monthly Review Press, Let Me Speak gained a broad audience, read by activists and assigned in classrooms around the world, in large part because Domitila highlighted her alienation from the International Women's Year, or IWY, conference by describing it as dominated by elites and animated by a type of feminism concerned principally with sexual liberation and the erasure of gender difference. Her comments here, though, about the refusal to recognize the value of women's unpaid labor highlight one of the few areas of agreement at the highly contentious IWI conference and an important item of unfinished business a half-century later. Indeed, at the IWI gatherings, where conflicts erupted over everything from abortion to Zionism, the need to alleviate women's domestic labor burden seemed to offer the one point of broad agreement. Today, I'll first say a bit about the IWI conference itself and the historical and geopolitical context that produced it. Next, I'll describe how commitments to a developmentalist paradigm and debates about feminism shape the debates about women's unpaid reproductive labors. Then I'll turn to some of the efforts to consolidate the gains of IWI and the ensuing UN Decade for Women, particularly through the formation of overlapping networks of activists and intellectuals based in the Global South who use the UN and its agencies to press the question of valuing women's unpaid labor. These activists did not oppose women's participation in the paid labor force. They argued that most women needed not more work, but rather some form of recognition or remuneration for the labor that they already performed. Finally, I'll offer a brief assessment of where we stand regarding the so-called battle within the home, as Domitila called it, and the magical thinking that continues to surround the standard repertoire of state, market, and technology-based solutions. The Mexico City conference marked the first of 4 major UN women's conferences, including 2 more during the UN Decade for Women, a mid-decade conference in Copenhagen, and a decade-ending conference in 1985 in Nairobi, followed by the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. The UN designated equality, development, and peace as the 3 themes for International Women's Year and the UN Decade for Women, leaving up to speculation and debate what these anodyne themes would mean in practice. The Mexico City events drew some 1,200 delegates to an intergovernmental conference in the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Tlatelolco Plaza, and another 6,000 participants to a parallel non-governmental organization tribune, which took place 5 kilometers to the south in Centro Médico. It was among the very first of the UN conferences to include a parallel NGO tribune. It was one of the very first of the UN conferences to include a parallel NGO tribune, which turned out to be the highest impact part of the event. The UN Decade for Women took place amid what political theorist Nancy Fraser has described, channeling Carl Polanyi, as a boundary struggle over the divide between economy and society, a liminal period that allowed some flexibility in how activists could navigate ideological divides. Feminist intellectuals in the global south drew ecumenically from elements of what, in retrospect, appear as sharply contradictory imaginaries of political economy. They ordered a la carte from neoliberal and socialist menus, taking advantage of the space that was still, for the time being, held open by the non-aligned movement. Support for the new international economic order, centered on economic sovereignty and challenges to intellectual property, emerged alongside the advent of neoliberalism, which held out the promise of radical democratization through the cultivation of a dynamic civil society and decentralized politics. The neoliberal economic paradigms that took root in, or sometimes were forced upon, most societies at this point held out decentralization and local choice was a keyword here, with a promise of democratizing economies and devolving a power to communities. It's clear in retrospect that these were often false choices, but for women who had searched for decades for an entry point in decision-making processes that govern policies and resource distribution, these developments seem to offer ways to circumvent the hermetic, nepotistic policymaking apparatuses that remained inaccessible to them. The push for decentralization often came with efforts to promote self-reliance and autonomy, a framing that might be understood to naturalize market forces and sow distrust of state programs, or it might be seen as a strategy for countering various forms of imperialism. The INEQUALITIES events took place during the UN's second decade for development and reflected the considerable influence of Esther Bostrup's observation that most development schemes had diminished women's status and exacerbated gender hierarchies. International Women's Year cemented Bostrup's influence. As historian Joan Meyerowitz notes, Bostrup's 1970 book, Women's Role in Economic Development, had become, quote, the Bible for women in the development movement. By the mid-1970s, it had been excerpted for the USAID publication Development Digest, and a pamphlet version circulated at the IWY conference in Mexico City. Before IWY, as one scholar has noted, less than 1% of standard development textbooks considered women at all. And after IWY, no discussion of development policies could ignore them. Bostrup argued that the emphasis that most development projects placed on mechanization and market integration tended to elevate men and marginalize women. Her concern was that, in the developmentalist imaginary, quote, men represent modern farming in the village, and women represent the old drudgery. Her solution, and the proposal that gained traction among development advocates at IWY, was to integrate women into the modernization processes, giving them more access to technical training, credit, and wage labor opportunities. Building on her previous anti-Malthusian research showing how agricultural production increased to feed growing populations, Bostrup focused on how to make women's labor more productive, rather than how to recognize the labor that women already performed. The resulting Women in Development program, as development economist Naila Kabir explains, centered on the, quote, efficiency argument, the idea that women were productive agents whose potential had been underutilized under welfare-oriented approaches. Participants in Mexico City deliberated whether the socialization of childcare or the turn to market services offered solutions to the knotty problem of women's labor burdens. They also debated the corollary question about whether participation in the labor market would liberate women from patriarchy or further subordinate them to capitalism. Alongside these questions sat the even thornier problem of what labor counted as such. Prevailing productivist emphases of modernization and development strategies recognized only commodified labor, wage labor and production from markets, and either devalued or faced the subsistence labors that occupied most women's energies and that sustained households and communities. Domitille's testimonio gained an audience, particularly on the left, because it seemed to legitimate a Marxist critique of feminism. She described feminism as a campaign by rich North American women who sought nothing more than to imitate men's vices. Feminism, she asserted, was invented by capitalists to undermine class struggle. Quote, when we fight between men and women, she explained to a group of campesinas, we please those capitalists who created machismo to prevent us from struggling together, united. For this reason, the capitalists also created feminism. To avoid any confusion about who were the capitalists, this explanation was accompanied by a cartoon of Uncle Sam standing spread eagle, pushing a group of men to one side and women to another, caricaturing both literally and figuratively the ideological feuds between 1970s Marxists and feminists. Participants offered an array of solutions, including the socialization of reproductive labor under state programs, the restructuring of families to redistribute labor, and the reliance on market services such as commodified food production and paid dependent care. The UN's press release promised that International Women's Year, quote, gives the international community a unique opportunity to promote genuine equality between men and women, not only in law, but in everyday life. In the draft World Plan of Action, the document used as a starting point in the Intergovernmental Conference, insisted that a, quote, reassessment of the functions and roles traditionally allotted to each sex within the family and community at large is essential. The necessity of a change in the traditional role of men as well as women must be recognized. In order to allow for women's equal participation in all societal activities, men must accept shared responsibility for home and children. Yes. Absolutely. Thank you for letting me know. Not at all. I will slow myself down. Okay. So the socialization and commodification strategies would reorganize this labor, but generally retained the sexual division of labor. In both schemes, women ended up performing this labor in a commodified form. So if women were to perform less reproductive labor, there were two possible outcomes. First, that less reproductive labor would be performed overall, or second, that men would take on more of it. Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme stressed the importance of relieving women of domestic obligations, giving both men and women more balanced lives. The Colombian UNESCO advisor, Esmeralda Arboleda Cuevas, argued that men should, quote, assist even in washing children's diapers. They must help with domestic matters. And the Hungarian sociologist Alexandra Szalai produced a background paper for the conference based on a comparative study of time budgets, asserting, quote, by nature, women are not better equipped than men to carry out the great variety of tasks allocated to the housewife, end quote. The first area of debate centered on how to count women's unpaid household labor in a developmentalist regime, given the growing reliance on metrics such as gross domestic product, the GDP, and the system of national accounts to gauge economic growth. By the early 1970s, feminist social scientists had challenged the exclusion of women's unpaid labor from GDP and other productivity measurements, but to no avail. Viola Burnham, the wife of the Guyanese prime minister, insisted, quote, women's labor in the home is not unproductive labor, but rather forms part of the female labor force. Nonetheless, such objections gained little traction amid developmentalist paradigms that prevailed at the IWI events. IWI propaganda and planning documents stressed that women remained a squandered resource in development efforts, and the rendering women more efficient and productive by pulling them into the paid labor force would advance third world countries on the road toward economic security. Overwhelmingly, the modernization of gender depended upon the commodification of women's labor. The New York-based organization UN We Believe sponsored a series of glossy ads promoting the IWI conference, including one showing a man in profile with a woman shadowed in profile behind him under the headline, half the brain power of the world is out of service. The caption below explained, half the minds on Earth belong to women. Who knows what penalties of holding back their development? Who knows what the product of human thought will never see the light of day? This insistence that the labor market would emancipate women pervaded IWR events as delegates cited labor force statistics to demonstrate economic and cultural modernity. Egyptian First Lady Jahan Sadat, Cuban revolutionary Vilma Espin, U.S. delegation leader Patricia Hattar, and the Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova all cited statistics about women's participation in the paid labor force as evidence of their modernization. The UN itself celebrated images of women in non-traditional jobs. The cover of the first IWI bulletin, published by the UN Center for Social Development and Humanitarian Affairs, featured a stylized photo of an all-women's road crew in Lesotho. While the bulletin offered no discussion of the photo, the newsletter itself reinforced the productivist goals of shifting women from so-called welfare programs, to productive labor. This emphasis on labor market participation and productive labor ignored women's vast contributions, particularly in food production and preparation. Presentations at both the government conference and the NGO Tribune cited countless studies about women performing arduous labor for many hours every day, cultivating manioc, grinding corn, carrying water and firewood. A veteran employee of the UN Economic Commission for Africa estimated that women performed between 50 and 80% of the continent's agricultural production. Nevertheless, Erica Jalla, the director of the Social and Economic Policy for the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, pointed to the, quote, intolerable and colossal waste of human potential that women represent, and argued that the IWI should concentrate on integrating women into agricultural production and rural development. The liberal feminists who dominate the NGO Tribune recognized the effects of reproductive labor demands on women's opportunities, but they envisioned private solutions, such as the redistribution of household labor between men and women, or the use of market services. By this logic, once women enjoyed equal income earning opportunities as men, the comparative advantage of keeping women at home and sending men into the labor market would vanish, leading men and women to assume equal shares of unpaid domestic labor. Thus, they fought for wage parity and equality in educational and professional opportunities. As sociologist Manisha Dasgupta argues, they ignored the gendered logic of capitalism and the diversity of household arrangements, favoring, quote, commodification rather than socialization of feminized work of cooking, cleaning, and caring. The Wages for Housework campaign that had gained some traction in the United States and Europe did not have many advocates at the IWI meetings, partly because most socialist feminists, the strategy's most vocal advocates, boycotted the conference as a liberal bourgeois enterprise. Although some socialist feminists expressed concern that wages for housework would reinforce the sexual division of labor, others insisted that it would, quote, get money into the hands of women, and challenged the notion that women would join the working class only by getting a second job in the paid labor force. As political theorists...
Please, Jocelyn, 1 second, please. Just have a logistical question with the interpreter. Yeah, you can go on. You can go on, Jocelyn.
Okay, keep going, yes? All right.
Yes.
Okay, ready. As political theorist Kathy Weeks points out, the Wages for Housework movement proffered the possibility that feminists could treat the household as a factory floor and deploy the weapons of the labor movement, structuring their demand around the possibility of refusing this labor. And this echoes what Domitila Barrios-Tungada talks about in making this chart and supposedly going on strike. Despite the absence of partisans at the IWI conference, a variation on the idea got some airing in discussions. François Giroud, the French Minister for Women's Issues, advocated for government-paid mothers' wages, indicating that children provided women with a powerful weapon for their struggle. Instead of fighting to obtain men's work, she explained, women should try to conserve this control. While strategies such as wage parity, socialization, and wages for housework address the labor side of the household problem, anticipating that they would strengthen women's bargaining power within their households, other approaches focused on the household side, hoping to alleviate women's domestic labor duties by promoting family planning and so-called responsible parenthood. The 1974 UN Population Conference had sounded alarm bells about the so-called population bomb, emphasizing the threat not of per capita consumption by wealthy people, but rather by the gross numbers of poor people. The public agencies in the U.S. Had performed involuntary sterilizations on Mexican American, Puerto Rican, and Black women, and Indira Gandhi's government had offered women and men both incentives to accede to voluntary sterilization. Several participants recognized that reproductive labor constituted a full-time job that could not be adequately performed by a few underfunded public institutions or by a haphazard division of labor between men and women who also held paying jobs. Rather than the strategies of commodification, socialization, or redistribution, they argued for a strategy that dismayed many feminists, mandating a family wage for men that would allow women to avoid the double shift of subsistence and wage labor. An open letter addressed to participants in the IWY conference and signed by a group of prominent Mexican activists argued for a, quote, differentiated equality of gender complementarity that recognized the value of women's reproductive labors. High-profile participants echoed this emphasis. Egyptian First Lady Jahan Sadat argued that Western feminism, quote, does more harm than good, since we have to find balance in the family and in no way stage a revolution against men, but rather to work together. And Sri Lankan Prime Minister Srimava Bandaranaike insisted in her opening remarks to the conference, we must not think of man and women separately, but rather of the couple. This posture rested upon an insistent heteronormativity that reacted against both challenges to conventional family structures and the presence of lesbian activists at the IWI Tribune. Domitila Barrios de Chungara, like many Latin American participants, particularly marked their alienation from discussions of women's sexuality at the IWI Tribune. Pointing to interventions by lesbians and prostitutes, nearly always referenced in one breath as markers of Western feminist dissolution, Domitila performed her Marxist politics for a pronounced and vitriolic homophobia. Daily editorials in the Mexican press lamented the lesbian presence and celebrated interventions by so-called true feminists who extolled the virtues of motherhood. Despite the widespread agreement that women's reproductive labor burdens preceded all other impediments to improving women's status, the IWI's final policy recommendations returned the focus to incorporating women into the labor market. The final IWI World Plan of Action replaced its original draft statement that men must accept equal responsibility for home and children with a vaguer proposal, encouraging, quote, socially organized services to lighten household chores. Policy proposals centered on literacy, vocational training programs, and expanded employment opportunities. And the document did list, among the 14 goals for 1980, the mid-decade conference, the, quote, recognition of the economic value of women's work in the home and domestic food production and marketing, and voluntary opportunities not traditionally remunerated. However, unlike the proposals to integrate women into labor markets, this objective did not correlate with specific recommendations in national and regional action plans. Prescriptions for employment and related economic roles focused on employment opportunity, wage parity, training in technical and management skills, support for cooperatives and micro-enterprises, abolition of protective legislation and discriminatory hiring practices, and the promotion of, quote, concerted efforts to bring about marked improvement of the position of women in employment. The issue of unpaid labor apparently had gained enough traction to merit acknowledgement, but not enough to demand concrete policy prescriptions. The objective of women's emancipation was a serious reckoning with the contradictions of uncommodified reproductive labor that sat precisely in the liminal space between culture and economics that international policymakers and activists found impossible to reach. Reproductive labor practices vary dramatically, not only between wealthier and poorer countries, but also between rural and urban areas, between professionals and laborers, and among races and ethnicities. Rather than fostering unity among women, discussions about motherhood and reproductive labor set these differences in stark relief. Most IWI participants, especially in the Intergovernmental Conference, did not perform domestic labor themselves, but rather paid poorer and usually darker women, reinforcing the ideologies of race and caste. And amid the developmentalist emphases on labor and productivity, such divides played a particularly pronounced role in identity formation. As women from wide-ranging political, cultural, and ideological walks perform their identities for national and international media during the course of the conference at Tribune, the possibilities for agreeing on this most intimate realm of labor and identity diminished rather than increased. A year after the Mexico City conference, some 500 people gathered at Wellesley College outside Boston for a meeting on women and development, taking up one of the three themes of IWI and the UN Decade for Women. For several decades, participants from the Global South grew increasingly frustrated as they sat in the audience listening to a roster of US-based, mostly white women lecture them on the meaning and importance of development. Three prominent feminist leaders, Fatima Mernissi from Morocco, Nawal al-Saadawi from Egypt, and Malika Rajaphan from Thailand, published. Can I send us your text? I think I sent the text in advance. Sorry, a chat just popped up asking for the text. Does someone have a way?
I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I'm asking this about the interpreters. It's been very difficult for the interpreters to follow you, actually. And I think it's important for everybody to have access to your messages. So
okay. I sent the text
in
advance. I sent it a few days ago.
Okay.
But I can resend it now.
Adjustment?
Can I, if there's a place I can resend it, I can send it now?
Yes, please. It would be the easier way, probably. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but
Not at all.
for good cause. I will use them.
You can offer the cause. Where should I send it?
It can be here or by email, as you prefer.
Let me see if I can just put it in the chat. Sorry, this is a little bit of an operation. Research.
Yeah, don't worry about this.
Box. Okay. So I'm sending it now, and right now, let me see if I can tell you what page I'm on, because that would help, I think.
Yeah, I just got it on the chat. Thank you very much. I'm going to download it and it to the interpreters.
Okay. And I am on page, the top of page 20, if that helps. Right after where it says slide 16. Let me know when I should start again.
Yeah, we'll give it 30 seconds.
Not at all. Thanks.
We can go on. Just sorry about this.
No worries. Thank you. So, three prominent feminist leaders, Fatima Mernissi from Morocco, Nawal al-Saadawi from Egypt, and Malika Rajaphan from Thailand, published a critique of the conference explaining, quote, "We want to make sure that we shall never have to face the same situation that we faced in Wellesley. We realize that the people who organize international conferences did not learn anything from their experience in Mexico. The principal lesson that Wellesley organizers had failed to learn in Mexico City was that participants from the Global South had punctured the prevailing universalism and the liberal belief that some clearly defined set of prescribed women's issues might be extricated from the messy world of politics. Marnisi, El-Sadawi, and Badrathan were not the only ones pointing to the twinned experiences in Mexico City and Wellesley. The Indian feminist Devaki Jain recalled that she connected with future collaborators through their shared experience of marginalization at these gatherings. She explained, quote, "We brown and black women from the South found that every time we met, we would be in some kind of a position where we were critiquing what was being said by our Northern sisters, and then huddling together and saying, these women, they are neo-colonists." It became very humiliating, because then the people would say, these third world women, they'll come and disrupt this conference. These third world women, they are so political. It was kind of like these third world women talk like you talk of these disturbing punks. So that was all rather demeaning, end quote. Jane and others were marked as outsiders, intruders, and frequently non-white, and as Jane's invocation of disturbing punks signals, a destructive anarchic influence. These critics of the Wellesley Conference effectively reversed this colonial gaze, interrogating all the practices that the organizers sought to naturalize: the format, the personnel, even the topical focus. Wellesley Conference organizers called for efforts to, quote, value women's contribution to the GNP through home tasks and work in sectors where statistics were not traditionally kept, such as scavenging. For many women attending the conference, however, the solution was not the marketization of everything through the imputation of values, but rather a thoroughgoing reconsideration of what an economy was and what purpose it served. The question of how to account for women's activity had arisen with the earliest efforts at national accounting and become more pronounced with the UN's creation of the system of national accounts in 1953. The idea that the problem was limited to marginal activities such as scavenging reflected a complete misapprehension of the nature of economies and women's place within them. Kenyan anthropologist Acholo Pala pointed to the, quote, problem of the notion of integration of women in development, an expression developed by the United Nations and largely adopted by international aid agencies. One might well ask, she continued, integrating women into what development? Women, she emphasized, were well integrated into their economies, but the economies themselves were kept in dependent status. While the organizers attended to the implications of patriarchal traditions and policies, Southern participants pointed to the impact of capitalist investment and particularly the role of multinational corporations, a topic that organizers deemed a political distraction. Frustrated by the dynamics they encountered at Wellesley, a group of African participants signed an open letter to the organizers explaining, quote, "We wish to register here our deep objections to the language used in dialogue with us by some of the conference conveners, which ranged from the patronizing to the insulting. Rejecting the conference organizers' presumption of agenda setting, they continued, quote, we would like to remind the conveners of this particular conference that much of the wealth that allows for the funding of conferences such as this is derived from the exploitation of the regions from which we come," end quote. Capitalizing on connections they've made among other African researchers and with potential funders, a group of participants formed the Association of African Women for Research and Development, an organization focused on the, quote, decolonization of research in Africa that favored research directed toward solving pressing problems which affect the daily lives of our peoples. IWI and the UN Decade for Women fostered an explosion of such civil society organizations and networks, often in resistance to the strategies of improving women's status that dominated gatherings such as Mexico and Wellesley. Research centers on 3 of these networks, all based in the Global South and with a focus on political economy and on an effort to reorient feminist activism around an ethos of care rather than of rights. The first A word, the one that I just mentioned that started after the Wellesley Conference. The second is the Development Alternatives for Women for a New Era, which goes by Dawn. It now has just changed its name to Dawn from that very clunky name. And the Encuentros Feministas Latinoamericanos del Caribe, which I think is probably familiar to a lot of people at this conference. These networks advocated for a political economy oriented towards social, cultural, and ecological well-being and sustainability, rather than the developmentalist emphases on growth, productivity, and efficiency. Notably, the activist intellectuals who populated these networks came of age not only amid waves of decolonization, although that was quite important for their formation, but also amid the creation and implementation of the idea of a modern measured economy, the creation of GDP and system of national accounts. These were not mass organizations, despite persistent efforts to address the needs of popular classes, but rather consisted predominantly of urban intellectuals, including a disproportionate number of academics. Their founders came from middle class or even elite families and often had attended universities in imperial centers, returning to contribute to the project of post-colonial state formation by working in academic and policymaking positions. All three networks remain based in the global south. AWORD is headquartered in Dakar, but has chapters in 14 African countries. Since their first meeting in Bogota in 1981, the Encuentros Feministas have met every 2 or 3 years in cities throughout Latin America, most recently in 2023 in El Salvador. And the Dawn Secretariat has moved from Bangalore to Rio de Janeiro, to Barbados, to Fiji, to Nigeria, to the Philippines, to Thailand, and back to Fiji. And although they all confer with supporters in the global north, their memberships consist of women who reside and work in the south. As Dawn founder Devaki Jain explained to an interviewer, quote, when you are struggling, politically located in your own political fabric, the incentives, the vibes, your priorities, your capacity to do is very different than when you're living in a country with a social security base where your gas and water supply works and where every morning you read the Times of London. Despite important similarities, these networks had distinct profiles. AWORD was the most explicitly and unambivalently academic and focused principally on efforts to decolonize the research that provided the foundation for policymaking. Founder Marie-Angelique Savigny insisted during the decade 1980 Copenhagen conference that it was a misconception that research is a luxury that Africans cannot afford. AWORD sought to replace foreigners' fixation on population and nutrition with a research agenda defined by Africans themselves. The Encuentros Feministas brought together academic feminists with burn-it-down activists and free-thinking creatives that have been as much consciousness-raising sessions as political meetings. If the AWORD gatherings felt like a cross between an academic conference and a UN agency meeting, the Encuentros felt more like carnival. They have always included artistic performances and displays and fostered vocal protests among participants, often around issues of insufficient inclusivity, as well as strategies and priorities. While Dawn and AWORD both established headquarters, leadership structures, and consultative status with the United Nations, the Encuentros are a more loosely defined collection of intellectuals and activists who gather every few years, moving among Latin American cities. The flavor and agenda of any given Encuentro is strongly informed by the local organizing committee. Still, there's a sense from the proceedings and published accounts of the Encuentros that participants see this as a movement and expect there to be some accumulation of knowledge and understanding from one meeting to the next. Like AWORD, the Encuentros Feministas reflect their regional context. During the 1980s, participants spent considerable time discussing U.S. interventions in Central America, the abuses of military dictatorships in the Southern Cone, and the effects of the IMF and World Bank imposed structural adjustment programs in the wake of the 1982 debt crisis. Dawn started in 1984 with a meeting in Devaki Jain's Bangalore living room to prepare a white paper for the UN decade-ending conference in Nairobi. The gathering consisted of women who moved between academia and policymaking, often working as advisors within their home governments, with an awareness that policymakers responded to pressure from civil society. Dawn promoted a decentered approach in which alternatives would be created through the accretion of dispersed but significant changes in practice, pointing to examples such as the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, or the Green Belt movement in Kenya, the Grameen Bank and Women's World Banking that provided affordable credit, and the widespread translation and circulation of the Boston Women Health Collective's classic text, Our Bodies Ourselves. If anyone was first and foremost a research organization that sought to inform policymaking, and the Encuentros, a happening that sought to influence social movements, Dawn oriented itself more toward the intersection between policymaking and activism, addressing the recommendations to quote, conscious feminist activists, as it is they, by their pressure, who can exchange policymakers. Although many of their members worked at times for the United Nations and its constituent agencies, these networks all had an ambivalent relationship with the institutions of liberal internationalism. The UN Decade for Women, including instruments such as the 1979 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, better known as CEDAW, created mechanisms and reporting structures that women's organizations could leverage to pressure their home governments. Furthermore, UN agencies often had more resources than local governments and were, at least in principle, more responsive to women's concerns. All three networks often planned their meetings around preparing for and participating in UN-sponsored meetings, often reading draft documents line by line to assess their implications for women's lives. David and Dawn worked directly with UN agencies that supported and participated in their meetings, while the Encuentros Feministas often structured their agendas around influencing UN policies, but preferred to keep the UN itself at arm's length. These networks, to one degree or another, took up elements of contemporary feminist thought, particularly regarding the maldistribution of power and resources, and were self-consciously transnational, with memberships that cross political borders rather than having national delegations. Unlike the established NGOs that dominated the UN Commission on Status of Women, they analyzed issues within a feminist framework, however they understood that. And as one founder explained, quote, rejected rigid and heavy bureaucratic structures in favor of informal, non-hierarchical, and open structures and ways of operating. This change marked a generational divide, reflecting the ethos of post-1960s social movements. Dawn founder Devaki Jain recalled, quote, we, the new ones after 1975, initially denounced what we called the conservative brand of NGOs. I don't mean openly, but we just felt that they were old, feudal people, and we were the new, the world changers, end quote. Although these networks embraced elements of neoliberalism, emphasis on choice, autonomy, decentralization, and the cultivation of a robust civil society, they challenged the larger political economic project, calling instead for a reimagining of what constituted development and, by extension, an economy. They criticized structural adjustment programs that eviscerated state-run social services and shifted agricultural land to commodities production and higher yield processes that fostered food insecurity and desertification, both problems that contributed substantially to women's labor burdens. At a 1982 UN meeting on technical cooperation, representatives explained, quote, modernization and development have meant a few schools, a handful of industries, and ever-growing importance of cash crop production and other cash-generating activities. Each of these new institutions have increased women's work and simultaneously decreased the time and resources that the majority of women have to spend caring for their children and for their own well-being, end quote. These critiques led all three of these networks to insist upon the most prescient arguments of the field that would come to be known as feminist economics, to wit, degrowth, ecological sustainability, and the looming crisis of care. The principal intervention of feminist economics, that all extant economic metrics, most especially GDP and the system of national accounts, ignore the largest economic sector by omitting the vast amounts of time, labor, and expertise required to sustain societies, was ineluctably evident in parts of the world with more robust subsistence economies. If the fiction of GDP was clear in places such as New Zealand and France, it was incontrovertible in places such as Zambia and Bolivia. The International Labor Organization legal advisor Krishna Ahuja Patel explained in 1979, if a total range of women's actual economic activities were taken into account, a different picture of social reality begins to emerge. While the Encuentros Feministas were born of a full-throated endorsement of feminism, followed by endless disagreements about what that actually implied, both Dawn and Award sidled up to feminism more cautiously, and always with a disclaimer that they sought an alternative to Western or Northern feminism. As they prepared for the 1985 Nairobi conference that would conclude the UN Decade for Women, all three of these networks claimed a feminist orientation, but had refined that label to more closely reflect their own epistemologies and priorities. They insisted that sexual liberation and economic autonomy were inextricable, rejecting the dyad evident in the contemporary media coverage, as well as in texts such as Dorothea's Testimonio. Dawn organizing principle stated control over reproduction is a basic need and a basic right for all women. And our bodies have become a pawn in struggles among states, religions, male heads of households, and private corporations. End quote. Likening patriarchal domination in the household to imperial domination around the world, the 1982 Dakar Declaration enumerated a catalog of prescriptions, including the disruption of patriarchal structures and the sharing of domestic responsibilities. Such a transformation, the authors elaborated, would require granting women complete control over their sexuality and decisions regarding pregnancy. Feminism, the declaration stated, provides the basis for this new consciousness and for the cultural resistance to all forms of domination. As editor of the popular weekly Dakar-based magazine Famille et Développement, Award founder and early Dawn member Marie-Angélique Savigny regularly ran articles about the importance of women's sexual pleasure, masturbation, and the need for access to safe abortion care, alongside the regular feature of a petit lexique économique to provide readers with a primer on economic ideas and terms. In the decade between the Nairobi conference that concluded the UN Decade for Women and the 1995 UN Women's Conference in Beijing, the geopolitical context for all of this activism was radically transformed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Cold War eliminated the most effective counterweight to capitalist modernization and neoliberal depredation. The productivist framework evident in the 1975 IWI conference sowed the seeds of the neoliberal project that by the 1990s called for the commodification of everything from air to water and the beginnings of the microfinance movement. The three networks described above, which had spent years pushing the Marxist left to take their concerns more seriously, had to reorient their strategies for a world in which every woman was supposed to become an entrepreneur with a business plan. The association of feminism with neoliberalism had fueled an anti-feminist backlash in many parts of the world. Historian Amina Mama explains in 2020, it is still an African commonplace to attribute anything concerning women, rights, peace, and development to feminism or Beijing people in a way that situates it as a dangerous foreign interference, racialized white, and sexualized lesbian. Still, the UN Decade for Women had fostered an organizational infrastructure that brought together women of different views and backgrounds, particularly bringing women from the global south in closer contact with various strands of feminism and bringing women from the global north in contact with the radical diversity of women's epistemologies, needs, and experiences. These networks brought feminist perspectives to bear on all issues, human rights, environmental degradation, and economic justice, as well as those that at the beginning of the decade had been considered women's issues, such as reproductive rights, domestic violence, and equal opportunities. As Dawn founder Peggy Antibus described it, the infusion of feminism as a transformational politics had fundamentally changed the strategies adopted by activists, such as those who populate these networks, but also their engagement also transformed feminism itself. The Beijing conference took place at what might be considered the high watermark of neoliberalism, following the passage of NAFTA and prior to Latin America's pink tide of anti-neoliberal leaders, starting with someone like Hugo Chavez. This new context has opened possibilities to address the critical issues of women's unpaid labors. By the 1990s, neoliberal policies have precipitated what was called a crisis of care, as evidence mounted that market services were both inadequate and exploitative. The 2008 revision of the System of National Accounts, the first since 1993, recognized the importance of non-market labor, including elements such as dependent care and household labor, but they are still relegated to optional satellite accounts and not included in GDP. The International Labor Organization began to attend more closely to the rights of paid domestic workers, in 2011 passing Convention 189, calling for decent work for domestic workers. And in 2018, the ILO published a report indicating that unpaid care services amounted to $11 trillion, or about 9% of global GDP, a measure that organizations, including Oxfam and the Boston Consulting Group, have tried to calculate in recent years as well. The following year, the ILO returned to an effort launched in 1975. This is, you can hear Alexander Salai's study from that pre-conference background paper. Returned an effort in 1975 to compile time use data to measure the economic importance of unpaid labor. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the extent to which households depended on both paid and unpaid care laborers. So that is to say, 50 years after the Mexico City conference marked International Women's Year, and Domitila Barrios de Chungara dubbed the battle within the home is still afoot. There have been important gains in the intervening half century, but the question of how to recognize the vast amounts of women's uncommodified labor, the most unifying issue at the Mexico City conference and the most radical agenda put forward by South-based feminist networks, remains conspicuously unresolved. Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing so we can talk. I don't know if there's even any time for discussion. But...
Muito obrigada, Jocelyn, pela sua intervenção, sua conferência. Foi muito interessante porque nós pudemos ver a relação entre
Thank you, Jocelyn, for your talk. It is very important for us women to understand the relationships between work, gender, and the social movements headed by women in a historical perspective. I believe that today with us we have several people who were part of these social movements that were described by Jocelyn. And now I would open the floor for questions and answers because we are running a bit short on time. But at least I believe we do have time for at least one or two questions for Jocelyn, so we can hear a bit more on her end. Are there any people, is there anyone who wants to make a comment or ask a question or to put forth anything for consideration or to understand a bit more about what Jocelyn has just told us about? We have Nadia, who was asked to take the floor.
Duas pequenas. Não, eu queria antes de
I
tudo.
have two small observations. First and foremost, I would like to tell Jocelyn about my absolute joy and thankfulness for the quality of the overview you have just delivered. An overview of a 50-year history, and it's so funny because I've just noticed that it's been 50 years. It's 2025 now. So I think that's an additional bonus of our conference is calling our attention for this 50-year history and celebration. And I would also like to share another observation, which is which has to do with a purely Brazilian context. I believe that my colleagues may need to correct me if I'm wrong, but as for Brazil, it was really curious because the Brazilian participation in this conference was preceded by a certain, let's say, I'm sorry, translator, but I'm going to say the expression in Portuguese, a competition between the representatives of the dictatorship and the women's movement, because the dictatorship wanted to send women that represented them as Brazilian representatives. And politically, it was really a competition, a strong arm between who would go. So there was a difference between who was the government representative and who actually attended the conference. So the Brazilian presence was heavily disputed. Years ago, there was a doctorate student from Urbana-Champaign who was studying this period exactly. She was focusing on this period in her studies and trying to understand what happened at that moment. So, above and beyond anything, thank you so much. It is always a learning experience hearing you. Thank you.
Ele. Você tem que. Oui, bonjour, et donc je vais m'exprimer en français. Merci beaucoup pour ce panorama.
Good morning.
effectivement,
I'm going
très
to speak
riche et, qui
in
nous fait aussi
French. Thank you
réfléchir,
so much for this
parce que vous expliquez
very
de la
rich
dimension,
overview.
informelle des
It's an
réunions,
occasion for us to reflect on
aux
what
grandes
you said
conférences,
on the informal
qui ont jalonné,
dimension of the
ces réflexions
meetings
sur le
in
rôle
parallel
des
to the
femmes dans
great
le
conferences
développement.
that
Et
structured
je me demandais
these
comment
reflections
vous,
on the place of
vous
women
analysiez la place
in
de
development.
la
I
marche
was
mondiale
asking
des femmes
myself here, how do
dans
you
cette
analyze
réflexion
the
sur
place
le travail de
that
terre, le
is
travail de la terre.
occupied
Quand
by
vous écoutais,
the
je pensais au travail d'une
Women's World
collègue
March
Eva
on
Ayala,
this dimension of care and domestic work. And I was thinking of a colleague called Elsa Garon, who showed how domestic work is complicated to take into account within the movements that fight for women's rights and the social movements that fight for women who have a dimension of women's rights within their claims. And I would like to know what you think of the Women's World March in this dimension of domestic work. And I'm thinking here of the 1970s and the Dawn organizations that were presented by Jocelyn and other different movements that emerged in the 70s. Would anyone else like to speak? Laura Potassi. Good morning. I would like to congratulate Jocelyn for the extraordinary presentation and try to have a think of dialogue with the regional conference of Latin American and Caribbean women, which will be 50 years old very soon, and a dialogue between civil society, governments, and the agencies in the UN that are specialized in the Latin American system. So in the consensus, that is the agenda, such as the platform in Beijing, the conference consensus, they made a mark in the agenda, they left their mark in the agenda of many governments in the region, the Latin American region. In 2007, that was a foundational moment when we started the movements and the dialogue with the governments. So on the Latin American level, we have an interesting intersection with the institutional agendas of governments, because it came later. The ministries or secretaries for women and diversity and gender we have in Latin American countries came later. So it's very interesting to complement this excellent overview you had, you gave us with this other forum with an agenda that happens every 3 years, and the consensus says they show these changes in route and the behavior of civil society after the Quito encounter. Civil society built an ISO Quito, where we have measurement indicators based on civil society to fulfill the consensus of the conferences. So they made a contribution with this Latin American gaze, the parallel agencies and bodies we have in this region, and that before this global conservatism, this should be strengthened, I believe. I would like to pass the floor on to Jocelyn so that she can comment on these questions, and then we will have other questions.
Okay, apologies. There's a pretty substantial delay between the YouTube that I can see and as I wanted to hear the end of Laura Patassi's question. I'll be brief because I know that we're pressed for time. These are both wonderful questions. I think what they both actually highlight is what's been an animating question, or really principal finding maybe, of all of the research that I've been doing, which is that the most innovative and sustainable approaches to what we keep calling the crisis of care are coming principally from parts of the global south, where the sort of market-driven solutions never seemed tenable. I think it's really quite notable that the most dynamic area for care studies is Latin America, and the region of the world where governments have started to take this seriously. And I think it maybe starts with the Bolsa de Familia under the first Lula administration, but certainly in places like Colombia now, in Mexico, you're starting to see policies that are really, and not just in a welfare state sense, but are actually recognizing care laborers in a more substantive way. I think it's just a very beginning of what we're going to need, but I think that if in the mid 20th century, and certainly still in the 1970s and 80s, the trajectory of policymaking learning seemed to be going from north to south. That is to say, an imposition of a lot of market-oriented policies and modernization policies. I think the policy learning needs now to be coming south to north, and I would say particularly from Latin America, where there's just been a really remarkable set of developments, both in the research space and the policymaking space. The very much women, yes, I think that highlights the particular challenges of wanting to honor the differences, the cultural differences, the social differences around care, and needing also to find ways that women can have some leverage and some claims to rights. So that's anyway, I don't know I don't want to go on too much longer because I know we're running late, but Sophia, let me know what you think makes some sense. Okay. Sorry. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight that I think Laura's, Patassi's comments really showcased is the importance of the role of the United Nations in all of this. And as I mentioned in the talk, there's a real ambivalence about organizations like the UN. I think they're often seen as imperialist and condescending. On the other hand, and starting precisely in the mid-1970s, the UN has been a space for a lot of decolonial contestation, a lot of discussion about Zionism in particular. So a lot of kind of central questions have played out within the UN. And for many of these women's organizations, it was one of the few places that they felt like they could actually bring pressure to bear on their home governments, whether those were very local governments or national governments. So all of the reporting structures that not just from CEDAW, but from all of the other human rights treaties and conventions have created ways that women could again sort of get some leverage. And the ILO has been really, as you know, as part of the UN agencies, the ILO and actually also the World Health Organization have played critical roles here. And you know, in the United States right now, we're kind of obsessed with this thing about the deep state, but there is a deep state within the United Nations, which is all of these agencies that have people all over the world doing research, providing services, and those entities really are an opportunity and for a lot of this campaign for care, for recognition of care. And it's an infrastructure within which a lot of these women have come to meet each other and share ideas. So something like Dawn or A-Word, I mean, maybe Dawn above all, really a lot of that happened through UN meetings, like either attending UN technical meetings or preparation for UN meetings. So even when they were challenging the UN, it was in a kind of dialectical way, it provided a space for cultivating a kind of alternative vision. I do think we're pretty far. I mean, so I think a lot of you probably know the revision of the system of national accounts is happening right now. And it, by all appearances, and you can, you know, if you're interested in digging deep into this stuff, it's not light reading, but there is a lot that's on the current revision of the system of national accounts. It still does not recognize in any substantive way the value of care labor. So there is still a satellite account that is retained from the 2008 revision, but there's not. There haven't really been major developments in terms of recognizing the value of this labor, and I think it's going to require a much more disruptive intervention to bring about that kind of recognition. That is to say, recognition of non-market care labor of various sorts, including ecological care, social care, cultural care, yeah, all of those. I think that's about it. I don't want to go on too long.
Muito obrigada, Jocelyn, pela sua
Thank
extraordinária
you
conferência.
so much, Jocelyn, for your extraordinary conference.
Muito obrigada, mais uma vez.
Thank you so very much once again. I will call Nadia to talk about the next part of the agenda. Thank you very much. Bye-bye, Jocelyn.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Na sequência, eu acho que nós merecíamos
I
atrasar
believe it was worth delaying the coffee break to listen to Jocelyn. I think we were fed intellectually. We will have a small pause for coffee break, but that's a special coffee break. This is why I asked Elena for the opportunity to introduce this coffee. We call it Coffee with Posters. What is going to happen at this coffee break? We will ask you to observe that. We will be showing some panels with the results of the research by three researchers who are seated here: Laetitia Perret, Juliana Ganda, and Amanda, who is over there caring for the posters. They were selected by us in a program to include young researchers in our project. It was a national selection. We had lots of candidates, high quality candidates. We selected someone from the Rio Grande do Sul, one from Brasilia, and another one from Minas Gerais. some regional representativeness, and they worked on a special data bank that was experimentally created by SEAD Foundation during the pandemic, with questionnaires specially designed to think of the need for care and how those needs were being met at that moment. It was a great challenge to us. We helped SEAD Foundation to design the questionnaire. We didn't have experience on how to ask people in a context where we could not come to people's houses. And that data bank is public, it's available. What we did was to have a conference call to stimulate analyses on the bank. So our chosen candidates did wonderful work in terms of how we could do a survey using robots during the pandemics on such a subject and how that impacted data and what we could do with data. So we are very, very proud to have sponsored those panels. Rede Cuide is very happy to have included them, and I would ask you to have some coffee with posters in Spanish and Portuguese, and in English we couldn't play a little bit with the words. Anyways, congratulations to
Recording
the
stopped.
ladies. I'm sorry I called you girls, but that's okay, I guess.
Você não falou da. Você
Já deu? Deu aqui. Tá. A Nath entrou?
Ali já. Bom dia a todas. Vamos iniciar então.
Good morning, everyone. Let's begin this session number 4, whose title is
Recording in
Right to
progress.
Care and Care as a Human Right. I would like to thank, first of all, Nadia, for the invitation to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity to listen to these talks and participate in this debate with the comments by Professor Marcos. Unfortunately, but fortunately, I have just a break today to follow this seminar and the work that's been led by this seminar for Latin America and the world is extremely important. And I'm sorry, I did not introduce myself. I am José Ricardo Adson. I work at the Medical College at USP, and in the health area, we've been trying to expand the discussion on care and the concept of care and its relationship with human rights. And it's a great challenge because even though we've been a bridge between human rights and health, it's a great challenge to rethink the logics of care because it's more instrumentalistic and biometric. So it's really wonderful to listen to the colleagues here on this topic. And we will start. Each presenter will have 15 minutes. Then we will have a comment by Professor Marco Nobre for 20 minutes, and then questions and answers with the audience for 20 minutes. I will start our presentation calling Professor Laura Bonattassi, who is a professor at the Buenos Aires University, and she is the main researcher for the Latin American Institute for Justice and Gender in Argentina. She is going to talk about human right to care, a feminist Latin American achievement. Professor, the floor is yours. Good morning, Ed. I'm really pleased to be here, and I would like to thank all the organizers, my dear Nadia and the entire team, and the team of translators. I will speak slowly because it's been a big challenge for them to translate. And I will present on a theme that I've been working recently and constantly, which is identifying care on the regional level. In addition to being need work, it's also human rights. So I will talk about 4 main items that seem to define and summarize this in the region, because it's an overview that is collective, but that it has to do with the feminist practice of inquiring different players on different realms. And this is why I believe we managed to build the set of regional advancements this year, 2025. So, first of all, I would like to highlight and honor this autochthonous, indigenous definition and work on care in our region. So we were able to define care with the Latin, according to the Latin American work and papers. It's got to do with some specific features that happened empirically. We had many presentations on this realm yesterday where we discussed the most important advancements and how we can um, advance further in that sense. But the concepts are oscillating, and care as a need and care as a type of work. And that was the great leap in terms of discussing care, which is became a different concept, but leaving the domestic realm to conceptualize work that took us to the public realm. And we have a Latin American construct that is very important. And the feminist characteristic led to a dialogue that took us to a conceptualization of care in Latin America, in a dialogue with decision makers on the public realm. So we've been conversing with universities, public universities on the public realm to measure time, to build all the satellites around it and produce care and conceptualize work as care and care as work. The first results in the measurement via GDP for care was key to convince decision makers that care was very important as a value, as a working value for care. The second stage I'm going to talk about now deals with care as a human right. It's not about an emerging or new right, but it's in the foundations of the description of human rights. Later on, that became a logic that will continue to empower the academic work and the feminist demands, the demands by the women's movement, in addition to the work that, to the papers, the studies that was part of the banner of the feminist work and construction. The initial demands were in sexuality and health and reproductive health. And later on, we passed on to the discussion of the agenda of care. And here we see the value of the regional conferences in Latin America and in the Caribbean. And this dialogue with policymakers do not stop there. They will overflow into dialogues with the legislative powers to discuss care as a right, which is a process that is going on in our region and includes some decision makers. So we have an institutional interpretation that leads us to a constant work, a nonlinear work, which advances and recedes all the time. In this construct, why do we talk about care as a human right and not as a new human right? So let's talk about the 2015 agenda and later the 2030 agenda. This concept from Beijing of the cross-sectional approach that talks about the cross-sectional approach of human rights that defines a bridge between institutional players and the design of public policies. The initial diagnosis said that those two parties were divorced. That the states did not reflect the needs and demands that we had on care. And then we decided to take this approach to the realm of human rights because it's been discussed for many decades. So we had the committees for the pacts and the national pacts. Those who are here probably know more about this legal covenant, but we have to think about Belém do Pará as well. And those developed some standards we can see here on the screen. First of all, it states that they stated that human rights are not just for the vulnerable populations. First of all, we have to think about the idea of progressiveness to understand the set of rights. They cannot go back and recede in terms of acquired rights. We have a group that monitors internationally the states and that points out to those states that all the rights have to be respected, such as the right to non-discrimination. So in terms of human rights, care is a principle that goes beyond that approach, but it should be, but we should also congratulate feminism for this recognition of non-discrimination by gender. Another important thing is access to information, access to justice, and if I do not have an institutional mechanism to complain, usually to the judiciary power, if I have no person I can complain to, I don't have access to justice, and that access to justice must be considered in a broader way. So we also have the concept of the contemporary feminism, which is empowerment, and we've been working on this region talking about emancipation because it's not about individual empowerment, but in the wonderful presentation that we listened to this morning, we saw the entire process that took place in the UN for going further to this concept of emancipation. Along these lines, we find that all the instruments for care, when we talk about right to care, to be cared for, and self-care, and that was included in the latest Inter-American conference. But we talked about protection of motherhood, protection by the states, and the elderly, and based on that, we saw that care was part of all these rights. And when we follow that explicitly, we will see the word care in all these statements. We then recovered this conference by Nancy Forgrest yesterday, who said that the policy, that the definition of the concept of care contributed to the politicization of this, and this polysemy included the people with disabilities and those who approved the Inter-American the conventions that happened, We speak about the elderly, and we also talk about the concept of autonomy of the elderly and their right to care, focusing on gender, which invites states and proposes to states that ratify the convention to that they develop this care system. That was an important journey. And once again, I repeat, this journey was not part of the interpretation realm. The laws, the legislations started to deal with care in the 19th century in the field of interpersonal relationship, the care for children, the care for parents, and the care for people with disabilities or with an impact on mental health. So care has always been there, but they were seen as those relationships. And we also had the concept of the motherland of uh, which is patriarchal, and we speak about the parents, the relation, the, the responsibility of parents in the relationships. Likewise, in the field of regulation of labor rights and labor laws, we have the gender biases, just like what has been regulated in many labor codes in this region, were the discussion, they centered around the discussion about labor and family, so that the women could have more time to care for the home. So the structure of care was regulated according to the number of women who were part of companies, who were part of the staff in companies. And another great bias is that we have test devices that are concentrated in women, and some companies, some countries in this region do not have anything regarding women, do not state anything about women. We also have some policies of income distribution, and most of them in Brazil, for instance, is received by women, and mothers are are those who receive that benefit, but they cannot manage it. And we recognize paid work in the case of the Constitution of Bolivia and Ecuador. We had states that provoked a great transformation, such as Mexico, such as like speaking about the right to care for and be cared for according to the Constitution of Mexico in 1997. And in Chile, there was a logic of a citizen-made constitution, a citizen-based constitution that's also addressed the problem of care. And in Mexico and Colombia, the legislation states that care is a right, and in the field of self-care, we have the fair division of work by sex, and that is very heavy, that has a weight in the scenario. And the Ministry of Women in Argentina in 2023, which was closed now. In Argentina, we no longer have this ministry after 40 years of democracy. They asked the Inter-American Court to interpret the Constitution to make it clear that care is a human right, and being cared for, that to care for and being cared for is a human right. And they asked the court to establish parameters so that the states can fulfill their obligations towards care. And here we have an important core of transformation. The feminist agenda was key in this process because in within the conferences on women in Latin America and in the Caribbean that happened in Quito recognized care as a human right. Finally, we have the Buenos Aires Covenant that recognizes whereby the governments in this region. And the last point, and then I will conclude, is that I believe that we are experiencing today, first of all, the relevance of this topic. It's not a right to women to care for people and that they care better than men. So it's also a universal right. We have this field of self-care, for instance, but obligations are established. It's not just about challenges to public policies, but obligations. So the three different actors, three different players, we saw the expansion of the service sector for care, which needs urgent regulation. That was made very clear yesterday. The market will not be able to cover everything. And we also have the issue of the social moratorium by men. Men have never cared for anything throughout history. And I think this is very important when we look at the setbacks in rights in this region. We still have a persistence of the unfair division of labor and labor in general. It's a central issue, it's a core issue, and that contributes to ending poverty, but it's also key for democracy, and that's what we need to think about.
Estamos então agora à segunda exposição, que será feita pela professora Carolina Moreno, que é professora
Now,
associada
moving
da
on
Faculdade de
to the
Direito da
next
Universidade
talk,
dos
which will be
Andes,
delivered
é cofundadora
by
da
Carolina
Rede
Moreno.
Imigrantes
She
e
is
produção de
co-founder
discursos
of the
nessa universidade.
Office for Migrants and director of the Migration Studies Center in this university. Now, she will be speaking about care as a human right and women in movement, the regional context and its impact in Colombia. Thank you very much. I believe that the volume is not at the best volume. Good morning, each and everyone. My name is Carolina Moreno, and today, during my 15 minutes, I'd like to present some material which was drafted collaboratively and without Camila Vega Salazar, there would be no works. We've worked in this perspective in the last 3 years, and I want to share this with everyone. Thank you for the organization team for giving us the opportunity for this very enlightening dialogue and for giving us this space to speak. Firstly, from the point of view of rights, we are lawyers. Therefore, our perspective stands from the social and legal standpoints, and we want to know how rights impacts and really impacts people's lives. We want to understand how this legal decisions and other normative instruments really has an impact on people's lives. And the idea behind this is to engender some social transformation. Even if the law promotes several inequalities, it does, on the other hand, open up the field for social change. And this is the standpoint from which we developed this research with migrant Venezuelan women in that region, in Colombia, our homeland. And Colombia is always the country that harbors the largest number of migrant Venezuelan women in the world. Now, after this introduction, I'd like to say that this presentation builds on what we presented last year in Canada. However, we would also like to add a few other findings which were organized after the interviews and the focal points with 31 Venezuelan women in Cali, Medellin, and Bogota, the three largest cities in Colombia. One woman in Quito as well participated. So the idea is looking at the human right of care based on these women's narratives.
Por supuesto, para esto es importante poner en contexto desde dónde
To do
queremos hablar.
so,
Nosotras tenemos
it
una
is very
apuesta para
important to
trabajar,
give
analizar y
our
pensar
point of
la
view
situación
some
de lo que llamamos
background,
las
some
mujeres en
context.
movimiento.
The idea
Las mujeres
here
en
is
movimiento
to
son aquellas
work
mujeres
on what
migrantes,
is called
desplazadas
women
internas,
in movement,
refugiadas y
their
retornadas.
standpoint.
Estamos pensando en
Migrant
esta
women who are
categoría
either
como toda aquella
refugees
mujer
or who
que ha
are
tenido que dejar
moving
su lugar actual de
geographically, or the
residencia
women who
por
return
razones en
to their
muchas
homelands.
ocasiones
So
forzadas,
women
lo que
who
las
have been
obliga o expone a
constrained to
situación de
leave
extrema vulnerabilidad y muchas
their
barreras para
living
desarrollar su proyecto de vida en
situations because
condiciones
of larger reasons, which opens them up
En
to
nuestra ponencia
several
escrita, allí lo pueden ver, damos los
eventualities
números de
and
las
problems, and
migraciones, de la
also their
movilidad
need
humana,
for
tanto a nivel global como
decent
a nivel
work and
regional
living.
en América
So now
Latina
in the
y el Caribe.
numbers, I'd like to
No
show
entrar en ese
you the
detalle acá
numbers
porque
for
pues son
human
muchos
migration
datos, pero
worldwide,
simplemente
but
decir
more
que en los
specifically in
últimos
Latin
años
America
la
and the
migración
Caribbean.
en
Of
todo el
course,
mundo
these
se
numbers
ha
are very
incrementado de
large
manera
and
muy
varied,
notable.
but I just
Y
like
por
to sum
eso
it up by
cualquier
saying
análisis
that
que deje
migration
por
has
fuera
grown
la migración
exponentially
está
throughout the
dejando
world
un
lately.
porcentaje
Any
altísimo de la
analysis that
población
does not
por
consider
fuera, digamos, en los
migration shall
márgenes del
also
análisis. Y por eso nosotras
not
estamos
consider
trayendo
a
esta situación
very
a la
high
reflexión sobre los cuidados.
percentage
No, y esta es una
which is
primera premisa
represented
importante,
by these
no podemos
populations. That's
hablar de
why we wanted
cuidados
to
ni
bring
pensar en
these
respuestas
percentages into the
institucionales,
fold,
mucho
into
menos desde el derecho y los
the
derechos
studies.
humanos, si no
So
incorporamos a las
we
mujeres en
cannot
movimiento.
look
Son
at
parte
this
de ese
based
sostén
on
de
human
la vida
rights,
en el
from a
que
human
está
rights
centrado
approach,
el
without
cuidado.
considering women. They
Decía
are
entonces que el
part
incremento de la
of the
migración
movement
no
that
solo ocurre a nivel
sustains life
global,
and
sino que
care.
América Latina
Therefore,
y
an
el Caribe
increase in
es también
migration happens
reflejo
not
de
only
ese
globally,
incremento
but
notable
locally.
de la
Latin
migración.
American
Y como
and the
decía,
Caribbean
se
are
caracteriza, por
also
ejemplo, en este
important
momento con casi
migration
7 millones de
flow
personas venezolanas
centers.
en la región
So
y
almost
siendo
7
Colombia el mayor
million Venezuelan
receptor
people
con
have
3
migrated to
millones de
Colombia
personas
in a
venezolanas
region
viviendo
overall,
o
and
queriendo
in
permanecer
Colombia
en Colombia,
specifically
lo que
over
nos
3
obliga
million
a una
Venezuelans
reflexión
who either live
con
or
la
wish
migración.
to continue to live in Colombia. This really leads us to the need of considering migration
Paso al
critically.
siguiente punto y es habiendo
So,
dejado claro
moving
que la
on
migración es un
to the
eslabón
next
importante del
issue,
análisis e ineludible,
after
pensemos entonces cuáles
considering
son las
that
barreras que
migration is
experimentan
an
las mujeres
important
en
issue
movimiento
of our
y porque el
analysis, firstly
cuidado
we
en
must
esta
then
reflexión es
consider
tremendamente
the
importante.
barriers, the
La
challenges
migración está
that these
altamente
women who are
feminizada
in
a nivel
movement, and why
global y a nivel
considering these
regional.
barriers
Las
is very
mujeres
important.
representan el
Migration is a
50%
gendered
de la
project
población migrante
situation
y las
globally.
mujeres ya han
Women
emparejado a
represent
los hombres
50%
en
of
las
migrant
cantidades de
population
personas que
as
se
a
están
whole.
moviendo
So they
a
have
través
reached
de las
the same
fronteras.
level
Las
as
mujeres
men,
enfrentan
considering
barreras
the
para
overall number
encontrar
of
un trabajo
women
formal
who
con todas las
go
garantías que
through
ello
frontiers.
representa.
And they also
Tienen
face major
barreras
hurdles
para
in
tener
finding
tiempo
formal
propio
jobs
y
and in
hacer otras
obtaining any
actividades
benefits
precisamente
and
porque tienen una
guarantees.
carga
They
de
also
cuidado muy
have
grande y no cuentan
significant
con
barriers
redes en las que
for
puedan
their own
financiar ese
activities
trabajo de
personally
cuidados
because
y en
of the
muchas
burden of
ocasiones,
care
y eso
they
es bien
face. And
interesante,
they
a
have no
pesar de tener
standing
documentos de
networks to
regularización
balance out
migratoria, cuando tienen
the
una
work
pareja
of
hombre que
caring.
sale
So
al
this is interesting.
mercado,
Even though
es el
they
hombre y la
have
mujer se
legal
quedan
documents,
cuidando y
when these
ejerciendo,
women
digamos,
are
como ese apoyo
married
hogar para que esa
and when their
pareja pueda
partner
trabajar.
is a man,
Tienen
the
dificultades
person who
para
will be
convalidar sus
entering the
títulos,
labor
para
market
cierta
is the man,
experiencia
and the
previa en su
women
país
shall
de origen,
remain within the
en los
domestic
países de
sphere.
llegada,
That
y
leads
esto
them to
sumado a
a
factores de
problem of
discriminación,
recognizing
xenofobia y
previous
violencias pasadas en
experience, a
general, incluyendo
validation
la
of
violencia
academic titles,
sexual.
and so
Yo
on.
no me voy a
And
detener, por
also,
supuesto, en la descripción
this
del
leads
derecho
to
humano al
sexual
cuidado, que lo
violence,
toma todo en el área
xenophobia,
ha dicho
and
de
such.
manera
I'm not going
previa,
to
lo cual
describe
suscribimos
these in depth.
completamente, pero decir que esta
Uh,
conversación del
Laura
derecho humano al
has
cuidado y el
mentioned this
papel de las mujeres
beforehand,
en
and we agree
movimiento se
entirely.
inscribe
We'd just
en un
like to say
proceso
that this
regional en el que estamos
dialogue
esperando,
is
por
circumscribed within a regional process in which we expect the Inter-American Court to determine the content and the scope of care as a basic human right. And I'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the opportunity this discussion today gives us, especially in terms of litigation of cases of women who are in migration movements and movements within Colombian courts, but also in the region as a whole, which might lead us to try to move forward in this context. That is a reflection on their legal rights. You can see a QR code on screen, and by accessing this code, you will access the report of what we found, our findings with these migrant women. So, of our findings, firstly, migration regulation is absolutely key to achieve adequate social economic inclusion. The second finding was quite surprising, even though it is quite basic. And that's what I wanted to stress right now. The lack of regulation in migration is not only a barrier for personal life projects, but also the burden of work, which is not balanced out by a network of peers or friends, poses specific examples of problems and hurdles for women in migration. I'll bring you the specific example of a young Venezuelan woman with 4 children, and we asked her whether she had a permanent visa. Her answer was that no, because she did not have the opportunity to obtain this visa because she had no one to leave her children with. This shows us in a nutshell how migrant women are not a block, a type of block. They're very heterogeneous. And we told this woman that she could move, she could petition for that within legal parameters because her burden, her work burden, hindered her and did not let her have access to the necessary documentation. The International Court of Law set an important precedent regarding a woman who had undergone domestic violence and who was not registered in the system. She obtained the right to obtain her legal documentation to the legal court. So this is absolutely key, as Laura mentioned before. In other talks before, in our colloquium, we'll be focusing on Colombia and on the documents that I presented. And also our care policies that have been adopted in Colombia. I need to wrap up now, so I cannot delve any further into that. But just to wrap up, I'd like to say that in Colombia, we have a document and we have a series of nationalized care standards, namely the Medellin and the Cali documents, which are being built as we speak. I just like to say that for CEPAL, the Bogota care system is, quote unquote, a pioneering strategy in Latin America, which considers care as an important asset and that recognizes the amount of time that women need to devote to care. However, we have our doubts and problems regarding this because we had the opportunity to speak with Venezuelan women who are part of this, and when they were asked whether they had access or participated with these government services, their answer was no, especially the youngest who was pregnant at the time. And the next question was quite obvious. Why wouldn't you use the system care, for example, yoga and others? Their answer was, we don't have time. Who will look after our children? Who can look after our home? So these women are currently on a waiting list. There is a regional ACNUR office that is open for consultations on Wednesday, meaning the real care that these women can access is, in fact, quite limited. For any type of petition, they need to have time to make that petition, and time is one thing these women do not have. Lastly, I'd like to wrap up that the definition of what care is must consider gender. It must be done from an intersectional approach. And to us, this migration approach is very key, and that women in movement need to be recognized, either those who are in transit, those who wish to remain, or those who are actually returning to their homelands. The USA precedent has had a huge impact in our region. These are women who have been deported with their whole families. How can we face this new situation? How can we include them? And we must understand that on their shoulders lies life as we know it. And we need to recognize care. And when we do so, we recognize their contributions to life. So the women in movement need to be included in this reflection, in this category. Thank you.
Obrigado, professora Carolina. Agora a gente passa para terceiro trabalho a ser apresentado.
Thank you, Professor Carolina. Now moving on to the third presentation,
professora de Direito da
to be
Universidade
presented by Professor Estela Regina Vieira, who is a teacher in the law school in São Paulo. She also is part of the POINTER network that is associated with the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning called SEBRAP. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking our panel, José Ricardo, Laura, Carolina, Marcos. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Nadia, because that's what all of us are doing, and we need to actually thank her. And to the whole team that was part of this research, nominally Bruna Gotti, Ana Clara Kink, who is with us here today, Isadora Caldas in Recife, and Cylon Pereira, who helped us program the robots. And a special thank you to CCI SEBRAP, who really helped us even from a financing point of view. We will be presenting part of this wider research, which is on the legal architecture of care. Pedro and I presented this in the first Who Cares presentation. Is the microphone too low? Do you need me to speak any closer to the microphone? Okay. So back on track, I'd like to thank Pedro. He was the one with whom we first started considering the idea of legal architecture of care. And today I'll be speaking about a specific aspect of our research, which is research within legal courts. So just to give you some context of what our proposal is within the Who Cares project, I'd like to say that our basic idea was to build, or at least start to design, the legal architecture of care in Brazil from three main starting points, considering what Laura has mentioned, of course, the human right to care. So we'd like to, we consider this based on three interconnected phases. Firstly, organizing legal literature on care. This is what we presented in Paris, understanding how care was considered by lawmakers in Brazil. Then moving on to step number two, which was systematizing the legal framework of care within Brazilian law. As Laura said, where even though the legislation does not consider care per se as named care, it is found within civil, legal, work, legislative frameworks. And thirdly, mapping how the very concept of care has entered as it is employed within the judiciary framework. So this is what we will be focusing on today. So our goal is considering how this very notion or concept of care, how it is taken within the legal judiciary framework of Brazil. Based on our previous finding, we wanted to understand how this disconnection or fragmentation between the timing of legal studies and the timing of a law and the timing of legal care, and how these three times are considered. We have several feminist movements which are adding social pressure, the needs of the pandemic, which created a host of different needs, and how the legal framework has specific needs of its own. So the language of care is verbalized by social movement. It is legitimate, and several social movements, such as domestic workers and carers in Brazil, how they are how they are demanding their rights from the legal standpoint. And as Pedro and I said in our first paper, the fragmented regulatory treatment of care in every legal instance. For example, penal spheres do not consider this to be the same as other types of legal spheres. So a woman who needs to leave home for work and who suffers domestic violence will be considered differently by different judges, based on different legal standpoints. And this is what we call fragmentation in our studies.
Foi de analisar e coletar decisões de tribunais, fazendo duas frentes. Primeiro, uma análise quantitativa do que apareceria.
First of all, we were considering a quantitative analysis using the keywords as care and caregivers in the feminine term as in Portuguese, so women caregivers or female caregivers, and later an analysis of samples, a qualitative research on what is being cared or what is being dealt with when we talk about care in this process. So we decided to collect that in three fronts: criminal law, civil law, criminal law, and labor law, always looking at the rights and obligations of those who need care and those who offer care. We decided to look at some decisions that were appellate court decisions, or the so-called second instance in Brazil. We decided to look at four courts: justice courts and labor law courts, and we decided to start from 2012, which is when our legal system started using an electronic judicial process system, to 2024. And we, in our final collection, we had bots to decide to do the collection, and we had over 800 cases. So this is just for you to have an idea of what happened throughout the time. We see the growth in what you see as the green bars with what the robots found in the processes with the word care. And the black line is our counterproof of what you have on the database. Actually, in the labor courts, we had a big increase between 2022 and 2023, which is when the pandemic ended. But we had a different entry in the labor courts in comparison to the civil courts. So this is a process one of our perceptions is that our criminal law talks about care, the duty, the care duty, and a mission, care a mission. So it's a much more common word in civil law compared to labor law. This is the font is very small, but it's on the paper. This is the tree of the themes or topics found. All these lines are lines that refer to each to the main claims that are shown in the processes, and we just divided them into clusters that are care given within the family, both paid and unpaid, the care given by the market, and the care given by the state. So our analysis is based on this division, and we have the different colors defining what is criminal law, civil law, and labor law. We made this initial division, and we chose to look at 200 cases in each category and have an initial treatment with some questions for all, and then an in-depth analysis of 10% of them. So we analyzed about 500 processes in total, in depth, a little bit more. And here I will only have time to present to you the main results, the first results of these qualitative analyses. So we decided to present them by area. In the criminal realm, the main debates, more than 92% of the cases, involve unpaid care work within the family. They are mainly crimes against children and old people, including mistreatment, neglect, and failure to provide assistance to both children and old people, and great volume of cases of habeas corpus petitions grounded in the need to care for someone outside the prison, and that refers especially to women and especially mothers. So the Brazilian legislation grants an alternative to prison when you have someone who cares for children mainly. And what is relevant in the analysis of these cases? One of the most evident things is the debate on the duty of care in inverted commas, and all the activities that are included in that. So all the people who are being tried are tried because they are giving health care or not, good housing or not. They maintain care against violence, suffered by children and the elderly people. So the core of the debate in the courts is about what the duty for care means. And they have different weights to different members of the family. So effectively, something we expected in terms of the literature, mothers are more demanded than fathers when it comes to the measure of what should have been done. The only exception is that the women who are in prison do not have the duty of care. So a mother has to care for children in a very, very profound way. But when a woman is in prison, the child does not need any care from their mother anymore. They can be cared for by a neighbor, an aunt, whoever. In the civil law, when we talk about the unpaid work within the family, the main cases involve effective abandonment. There is an interesting debate in Brazil about fathers who do not care for their children, not just in terms of money, but also in terms of affection. Now there is a judiciary definition or a legal definition that love is optional, but care is a duty, saying that care is not just giving money to a child, but giving a psychological type of care, even though this father may not love his child. And we have an interesting discussion on the care that is given by members of the family who are ill, but they do not recognize that people suffer from a kind of labor related health problem when they care for a member of the family. So in the case of home care, the health insurance companies decide the quality of care being requested from this person. So do the people need a training and professionalization, or is it a mere care, as they call it, that any member of the family can give? In labor law, we have mostly the labor connections involving workers that do perform domestic work. So, for instance, a sister or a niece will care for an old person, and they are not recognized in terms of employment ties, even though they might leave their jobs and not be paid to care for a member of the family. So we have two examples, for instance, of those differences between men and women. In the first case, for a man, a father, they say that even though the father did not see the child for 11 months, he had too much work to do, so he didn't have to be present. And another case is a granddaughter who had two jobs in order to support her home, but she was accused of neglecting her grandmother because she did not give the care at home. So to conclude, is that I will say that the state is not held accountable for the care. It's only 5% in the civil sphere and 1% in the criminal sphere. The profile of people is very evident, and all other racial social markers. Race is hidden and invisibilized, but it's very evident in that sphere. And I know my time is up, so I hope we can continue this debate in the future. Thank you.
Obrigado, professora Regina. Agora passamos a palavra para o debate.
Thank you, Regina. I will pass the floor to Marcos Nobre, and who is a senior researcher at SEBRAP, where he works as a president, and he has written many books on the democracy and the limits of democracy, for instance. And his last book was awarded the Jabuti Prize in 2023. Now, Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Meu agradecimento aqui, primeiro a querida Nádia
I
e a todas as pessoas.
thank
Acho
my
que todo
dear
mundo tá
Nadia,
vendo, essa
first of
professora
all, and
é
everyone.
perfeita. Até
And
conectar o
everyone
computador
sees
eu consegui
that
aqui, até
things
extensão.
are
Então,
work perfectly.
agradeço
I
muito
even
pela
managed to connect to
organização
my computer
impressionante
here,
desse evento.
which is something
Agradeço pelo
seldom
convite, especialmente
that I am
porque
seldom
eu não
able
entendo
to
nada,
do.
nem de
And
cuidado, nem de direito.
I thank you
Então,
for the invitation because I
a
know
oportunidade
nothing
que eu tenho.
about
Não, eu
CARA
entendo lá,
and
mas eu sou
law.
curioso.
I'm a
Veja bem,
curious
não.
person. I don't
Aí
understand
você dá
anything
a
about
chance para a
them,
pessoa
but
perguntar tudo que ela quiser, sabe?
look, you give
Que é o
the
meu caso
person a chance to
aqui nessa
a
mesa.
chance to ask whatever this
Tenho
person wants
agradecer a
to,
generosidade
and
com a
this
minha
is the
ignorância.
case
Então,
here on this
a minha
panel. I
ignorância é tão
want
grande
to
que eu vou
um,
perguntar para
thank you
Laura
for the
algo
opportunity
muito
of
elementar, mas muito mesmo. Eu espero que
asking
sirva para
questions,
outras
and my
pessoas que também
ignorance
não são
is
do
so
direito,
big
né? Eu
that I
passei
will
5
ask
anos na
Laura
faculdade
a
de direito.
very
E eu
basic
tive
thing,
aula de
and I
internacional.
hope
Eu não lembro muito
that my
do que
question will
eu
be
vi lá.
useful to other people.
Mas
I spent 5 years
eu penso,
in
por
the
exemplo, nos
law school,
princípios dos
and
direitos
I
humanos que eu
had
aprendi lá.
a class on international law,
Uma
and
das
I
coisas
remember some of the
básicas quando
principles
você
of
aprende esses
human
princípios
rights
dos
that I
direitos
learned over
humanos
there. And
são
one of the
coisas que
basic things you
estão
learn
assim
on the principles of human rights
perfeitamente
are
colocadas
things
no
that are
paper da Laura. São todos os
perfectly
requisitos assim,
stated
eu fui
in
olhar
Laura's
lá no meu
paper,
manual de
all the
direito internacional para ver se
prerequisites.
todos os
I was
quesitos estavam
looking at my
cumpridos.
manual
Então,
of international law to
é
see
rigoroso
whether
o
all the
texto, pelo menos do
prerequisites
ponto de vista
were
do que eu
fulfilled.
aprendi.
So
Então, eu
the
cito
text
só
is
é
perfect
uma
from
frase
the
só, mas
point
ela é
of view
longuíssima.
of what
E eu vou para mostrar isso e para poder colocar
I learned, and I will quote one very long sentence that I will
não é sempre que você pode fazer
quote
pergunta
or
direto para a
cite.
bibliografia, né?
You
Então, ela
don't
tem que
always
aproveitar.
get the chance to ask directly
El
to your
derecho a ser
bibliography.
cuidado es
So
un derecho
the right
universal,
to be cared for
indivisible.
is
Indivisible
universal,
é muito importante para mim.
undividable,
É inerente a todas as pessoas para
and
recibir,
inherent to
respeito
all
a
the
sua decisão
people to
individual,
receive
cuidados de calidad,
care,
suficientes e
respecting
dignos,
their
que
individual
facilitem
decision,
el
the care
ejercicio
to
de su
work,
autonomía y promuevan una vida
that
independiente
will
a
promote
lo
an
largo de las
independent
diferentes
life
etapas y ciclos de la vida,
throughout the
sin que su
different stages and
situación
cycles of life
personal, social, económica pueda
without the
afectar a su
person's
ejercicio y
social,
sin que la identidad
economic, or
sexual, raza,
personal
lugar de origen,
will
situación
not
de
to
discapacidad,
affect the
orientación
exercise of
sexual o
labor
identidad de género
and
o cualquier otra
sexual
circunstancia
identity,
pueda generar
race,
discriminación
origin,
en su
or
ejercicio.
disability will not
Fin de citación.
create a discrimination to the
Para
exercise of one's labor.
esclarecer a natureza
So to
dessa
clarify the
indivisibilidade,
nature of this
outro ponto do
non-dividable nature
Laura também
of
faz referência
care,
que o
Laura
direito ao cuidado
refers
humano
at another
Então, esse é ponto
in a
importante
different
na
part of a
definição,
paper.
aceita
She
normalmente de
refers to the fact
direito
that
humano.
care
E para
is a
não deixar
human and
nenhuma
autonomous
exigência
right.
doutrinal sem ser
And
cumprida, ela diz também
in order not to leave any
é
demand
direito
from the doctrine to be fulfilled, she also says it's
quando
an
a gente considera
interdependent
todos
right.
esses
So when we
elementos,
can take into
eu
account
cito
all
novamente
these
o texto
elements,
da Laura,
and
a
I
su vez,
quote
que el cuidado
Laura's
sea un derecho humano implica que debe
paper
ser
again,
respetado,
the
protegido y
care,
garantizado en sí mismo,
the,
pero también
the
de
fact
manera
that
interdependiente
care is a
con otros
human
derechos
right
humanos,
implies that it
especialmente
must
con
be
los derechos
respected,
económicos,
protected,
sociales,
and
culturales y
guaranteed
ambientales de ESCA, no
by
solo para
itself
quienes lo
or per
necesiten o
se
demanden,
in
sino
an
de manera
interdependent
universal
way.
para cada
Other
persona.
human rights, especially economic, social,
Então, aqui
cultural,
eu acho que fica mais clara a
environmental
minha dúvida, que é muito
rights
elementar.
depend on that.
Se o
And
direito
my
ao
question
cuidado
is
não é uma
very
nova
basic.
classe de direitos,
If
no sentido
right
de
to
criar
care is,
direitos
is not a
emergentes,
new
e
class
se a
of
gente
right, and
considerar
it's
as
not
três
an
dimensões do
emerging
direito, né,
right, and if we consider the three dimensions
de
of
cuidar,
law,
de ser cuidado,
the right,
como
the
integrar
right to
esse
care,
direito
the right to be
na
cared for,
arquitetura
and the
arquitetônica
right
da
to
agenda da arquitetura?
to self-care, how do you include that in a framework of human rights? You know, someone who studied 20 years ago and cannot follow the novelties, that's me. You know, especially, I think, how doesn't that conflict with the other human rights? Because it's a multidimensional right. Even if you think from the perspective of the focus, which is the way to integrate all these things, I have the feeling that is superior to the other rights. So I'm thinking about this system from 1948. I understand it when it's an international convention, because I can have a better focus when it's part of this conference in the international convention. But how do we integrate that into universal law? So I believe that this is a change in paradigm, and if changes the paradigm, you have to change the entire framework, the entire architecture. I hope everybody has this question. I hope it's not my question only, and that overflows a little bit into Carolina's presentation and Regina's presentation, because we have the diagnosis of fragmentation. How do I integrate the right to care into the architecture of the law? You know, should we have a different type of legislation for to care to deal with care? So I would ask Carolina and Camila, who must be here somewhere. We know very well that joining the issue of migration and the issue of care is an essential thing today, and it's urgent, and we don't even need to take Trump into account to do that, because we have the problem of citizenship and how migration is a citizen migration as well. How do you migrate a citizenship?
Eu acho que o caminho que foi percorrido pelas duas autoras para investigar
I think that the points that were given by these two authors and the train of their thoughts and thinking seems to me to be very accurate, very well thought of, considering the idea of women who are in movement to consider care. The moment when I show people where, this is when everyone can understand, can see that I am inscribed in the Hegelian tradition that considers that movement draws the path forward. Now, the situation in Colombia is quite specific, and specifically due to some issues that were mentioned today, mainly the fact that Colombia does not only harbor immigration, but also emigration, migration to and from. So this is a very special case, and very important to consider these points. So the observations I want to make, my presentation is here, but I forgot to click on start. This defeats my purpose, right? So when I look at this situation, and what I wanted to say today is actually an invitation to Carolina to speak a bit more on the research work she did, because I only saw a certain aspect. Now, from my end, the curiosity your work engendered is more from a sociological point of view than from a legal point of view. This is me. If this is not appropriate, that's not a problem. You let me know. So I started considering the differences, disparities between Colombian citizens and Venezuelan migrants. Some of these were mentioned in your presentation, but I want to draw a specific point of view here. How are these differences or disparities lived, experienced in Colombia? Is this considered from the point of view of the legal framework, the legal sphere? Is there any type of serious xenophobia, which for the issue of care, I started asking myself if it gets any more serious, is it getting any more difficult? And also for the instance of Colombia, the three-dimensional suggestion that was made by Laura, which you once again consider that care is a right to give, to receive, and to self-care, and whether the government, the state, should be the main player, the main player in charge of care. So how do you consider these three dimensions and their roles in the Colombian context specifically, both from the point of view of gender and from the point of view of this disparity, this difference between nationals and migrants? Because when your paper mentions that there is a certain lack of adaptation in public policies, however, when you consider prior studies, there is, can we really understand how women who are migrating, women who are in movement, how can they experience these three dimensions? Do they experience them in different spheres, or are they experienced in tandem as a whole? In Portuguese, we would say, how do people get by? In Spanish, you would say, ¿cómo se vale? So how do people manage to get by? And the second question I would have was a discussion of care as a human right. Now, this is the very name of your presentation, care as a human right. And when I asked Laura for clarification, specifically as regards migration, on the one hand, it feels quite clear to me, and your presentation describes this, that if you do not establish this connection, it would be very difficult to connect care on the one hand and migration on the other. On the other hand, this issue is quite important, poignant, because the idea is inclusion in the human rights system itself, or at least including items that consider migrational movements in international agreements. How do we treat migration when people are in transit from the point of view of international agreements? Laura mentioned regional agreements. How could we consider this from the specific point of view of migration? So these would be my questions for you. And my questions to Regina would be, I know your paper is, of course, just a short abstract of a very large-scale empirical survey. If you do not experience research in law, it might seem easy. I can personally attest that it is not at all easy. There was no such study 20 years ago. It's quite recent. When you look at the diversity of the parties that are involved, it's not only the corpus of law as a from the jurisprudence point of view, but also investigating the parties, the need to investigate and study different types of law, very which are quite different amongst themselves: civil law, family law, labor law, criminal law, and so forth. When you spoke about fragmentation, and I think that's more or less what I asked Laura, when you consider fragmentation, this is determined in the two first parts of the research. You presented the empirical part, but these first two parts are very difficult because it has to do with jurisprudence, with understanding the legal frameworks, which are important. And that's when empirical research is adequately treated in terms of research for this diagnostical. So my first observation, I know that the paper is quite long, but I did see the need for including just a summary of the first two parts. Okay, you consider it fragmented, I understand, but I want to understand how you arrived at that conclusion. That's, of course, not something you can do right off the bat, right now, but it's for those who are reading your paper, understanding your concept of fragmentation might be a bit difficult. For example, from my point of view, I thought that we could use the word multidimensional and not fragmented. Depending on your understanding of what fragmentation is, the results of your empirical research might be different. So this is the diagnosis which lays the way forward for the empirical research. There's a certain part of the text which gives us a very important hypothesis, which explains the differences between the moments in which there is an increase in the demand for care if compared to other types of legal demands. And now he's quoting the text. The hypothesis for this difference considers a consolidation of what care means in literature and legal frameworks, both civil and criminal. So this was a quote. So my first question as regards to this is the following. You said that you use sampling techniques, but you don't tell us which technique. You say that there is a certain margin of error in classification terms. But since I've worked on this type of issue, I ask myself, what was your approach? I mean, did you work with statistics? Did you not work with statistics? Why did you choose, for example, a corpus of 200 lawsuits? Why? Why did you choose 10 among these 200 later on? So what were your motivations for these choices? There's not a problem. Making these choices is not an issue, but you just maybe need to justify your choices. Why did you choose them? My second question would have to do with the connection between the sociological approach and the legal approach. How do these two approaches connect? The connection is Nadia, of course. That's easy. It's a no-brainer for us. While your text says that the research on jurisprudence, the legal approach, encountered some differing elements as regards establishing category, and you chose, your approach chose to eliminate those which were dissonant, which were different. And then I quote what you said is the situations in which the frontiers amongst clusters seem nebulous or even permeable, which reflects the complexity and the multidimensionality of the relations of care. For example, labor law cases in which there are family relationships that are involved. Therefore, we decided to maintain the division based on Nadia's category. End of quote. I really do understand the option in the research design. It's quite obvious. However, I asked myself the following question. Maybe it might be interesting to explore these dissonant situations. It might be very interesting in two senses. Firstly, it would show the specificity of legal issues as they relate to sociological issues. Secondly, exploring these dissonances may lead to a change in the sociological categories that were established. There might be a need to actually change these categories. I'm sorry if my observations were too basic. I hope I didn't waste your time. Thank you.
Obrigado, professor Marcos. Agora
Thank
eu
you,
vou passar
Professor
o
Marcos.
microfone
I
para
would
os
now
expositores reagirem
invite
à
our
pergunta, depois a
panelists
gente
to
abre
take
para
the floor and answer
a
your
plateia.
questions.
A gente vai ter que
And
seguir
then we will
cronometrando,
open the
nós temos 15
floor to our
minutos para encerrar a
audience,
sessão. Então,
but we only have
sigamos bem
15
objetivos,
minutes,
tanto
so
a
let's
resposta
try to
dos
make the
speakers.
best use of time possible, both for the answers and for the
Felicitaciones a
subsequent
mis compañeras de mesa por las
questions.
investigaciones.
Well,
Y Marcos, bueno, qué suerte
I'd
que no
like
te
to
acordabas
start off
tanto de
by
derecho.
thanking
Quedo más
my
tranquila.
colleagues
Bien, un par
for
de reacciones. Muchas
your
gracias por los comentarios muy útiles. La primera reacción que quiero dejar con total claridad
observations.
son
The first thing I'd like to say, my first reaction,
no
well,
considero el
actually,
derecho
there
civil un
are
cambio de
two.
paradigma. Ese cambio de paradigma lo dio la Convención de Derechos del Niño, porque precisamente pasó de la consideración de los niños como sujetos de tutela a sujetos de derechos. Ya está el cambio de paradigma.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say
Personalmente
that
no promuevo crear una convención de derecho al cuidado. Para mí,
the change of paradigm. Personally, I do not support creating a convention of right. That's the issue in which the system of human rights is considered. It was created in the 21st century from it's had a starting point, but there is no point of arrival. It's importable. It's important to say that human rights resist an attempt in this, the law in this sense, which are dogmatic. It is quite extraordinary to consider in this sense, including gender issues in the human rights issues. This was actually a very extraordinary experience and way forward. In terms of these dogmatic fields, in terms of right, there was an important change in terms of the dogma consideration. Of course, considering the very notion, idea of care is obviously a multi-dimensional concept. So the three main fields here would be the right to care, to be cared, and to self-care. But when we sustain them, you cannot say that you can be a feminist if you do not consider violence. So we really need to have most importantly, we must have a non-dogmatic point of view, both regarding dogmatic civil rights points, and these really do exist in the Republican history and in the 19th century. For feminism, intervention in families and what the family is was quite important. That's why this dogmatic interpretation was very important to be mentioned, because initially women were not considered autonomous in terms of civil law. We didn't have that. That was acquired later on, especially from a political point of view. And that's an important issue in terms of discussion. Your observations are very welcome because they help help us to understand this particular aspect of what you call the architecture, the framework that you mentioned. It's very interesting to me. Why do we use the word architectonic or framework and not architecture? And so I like your observations. When you consider the architecture or framework, we need to increase the decisions of what is the right to education. Children, boys and girls, spend a lot of time in school. Why? What for? To exercise their right to education. And this is, in a certain sense, a mechanism of care for the families, and it is a way to ensure the secondary right to education. So when the schooling day ends, we can maybe suggest a second sphere, and then prioritizing the right to education for these children. And one of the principles on universality and the interdependence of human rights, this in the Vienna 1993 platform, we know that we must guarantee not only civil and political rights, but also economic, social, and other rights. This is in itself a challenge. It's not a new right. These rights were there. They were pre-existent. They were only identified then. And this is also something that was identified by the ILO. The first collective conventions guaranteed the right to motherhood for women in terms of their potential of being a mother, but not for the women themselves. Argentina still works within this concept, the future potential of being a mother. So everything that was built, the egalitarian convention and the processes that took place in the 90s, that showed us that the importance of the dogma and breaking this potential. And the next presentation that we will be seeing on care also speak about this regional pioneering construct to avoid fragmentation. My friends also spoke about the legal interpretation, and then we go back to the dogmas. I believe that's very important. This speech from Brazil focuses on the dogmatic responses to situations of care that reflect on labor needs. Thank you very much, Marcos.
Son bien robustas. Brevemente, dos cosas simplemente para ampliar lo que
Thank you,
mencioné.
Marcos, for the questions which seem quite basic, but they are not basic in nature.
Ese trabajo cualitativo se hizo con 31 mujeres venezolanas que tenían trabajo de
We
cuidado.
spoke about broadening a project, and that qualitative work was done with 41 women from Venezuela who cared for their family members, their children, they prepared food, all that meant the that meant care. We did a remote interview in Lima and another one in Quito. And what we wanted was not to state, to define what human rights are or care as a human right. We just wanted to know more about their experience in non-paid care and what it means unpaid care for a woman in the move. And our findings were like this, what is not mobile is the fact that women, even when they are in the move, they need to care, to give care. And if a woman does not have time to do things, to transfer their citizenship, for instance, they do not have documents. And to be documented or undocumented, when you are a migrant, it makes a brutal difference. So understanding the intersection between care and migration includes thinking of the adequate strategies that enable migrant women with their own characteristics, particular characteristics, to have access to those services. To It was key for us to understand what care meant to them. When we asked them what care meant, they were silent. So we asked them to talk about their routine, what time they got up, what they did, what time they took their children to school and brought them back. And they spoke about that. And then they were able to see their everyday experience and connect it to care. And self-care wasn't even part of their map, and they were not seen as a subject who has the right to receive care. And another interesting finding, I will not read all of them, but one of them was realizing that the care for those who care for many people was reason to leave but not to go back. So that was the tale or the narrative by a woman who was in Quito. So she left her country to care for her son who was very sick, and she went back to Venezuela to care for her father, because the only one who could give her father the proper care was herself. And I will briefly mention that the migrant women solve the issues with care when they have differences with their Colombian or Venezuelan peers. The Venezuelan women work more than the Colombian women, but they also work more than Colombian men, and that needs to be documented and systematized. However, they cannot use their previous experiences in their own country. So a woman who worked as a nurse in Venezuela may migrate to another country, and it's very difficult for her to validate her diploma, her degree. And so they start working with care somehow, but not as a nurse. So another woman was receiving per day, receiving money, being paid per day, which is something performing something that didn't have anything to do with what she did as a profession. On the other hand, there's a lot of informality. They simply work in menial jobs and temporary jobs just to make the money for rent or the money for their daily expenses, and their work schedule does not correspond to the school schedule. For instance, a woman school that works from noon to 5 o'clock is not good for this woman. On the other hand, we have gender violence, prostitutes, a hypersexualization of Venezuelan women, and that makes their situation a lot worse. Can you hear me? Well, first of all, thank you, Marcos. Marcos spoke about the relevance of the research law, and it's important to remember that the one who started research in law was Marcos in Brazil. And
bom, pensando nas suas provocações, Marcos.
thinking of your questions, Marcos, and taking into account what Carolina and Laura said before, in terms of the diagnosis of fragmentation, I think it was interesting that you brought that about, because this term fragmentation was also debated, was discussed. So when we spoke about fragmentation, we didn't want to refer to multi-dimensionality as Laura does, but it was to show that the law works in very separate boxes. So, and I agree with you that we should have an explanatory note for that. And thinking of what that we said, specifically, if we have a woman who suffers violence from her husband and a child who also suffers violence, when the judge judges that case, this woman is judged for not protecting her child from violence, and the judge does not look at the situation of domestic violence as a whole. So it's a multidimensional care, and the law that deals with that care in a fragmented way. Actually, maybe this concept was not very clear, and we ask ourselves, why is that better described in criminal law? That's because criminal law speaks specifically about care since 1940. When we look at labor law, that word is not even used. And the law number 150 was elaborated was designed in 2015. And I agree with the criticism, because we refer to the original text and we did not clarify what that means. In terms of the methodology, initially we thought about applying statistics to think about this qualitative sample. But when we did the first search and we encountered 1,000 processes, we looked at sample readings to look at the demands that were seen. And some of them were so relevant, we decided to analyze, to do an analysis by on the different demands, regardless of the weight of those keywords. Otherwise, we would look at home care only, because that's 80% of the cases. That sample analysis we do is to classify the different categories and to look at our margin of error. But for the choice, we considered the diversity of cases and what the judges are debating more than the sample. And why 220? I hope you understand that we had deadlines and very small teams. So the 200 cases are filtered by a robot, because we can ask whether judges are men or women, who those judges, this judging, the people who participate in the lawsuit are. And to conclude, you talk about the dissonant elements and the border between clusters. And Nadia, And I agree that exploring dissonance could be more interesting. But the fact is, we are still consolidating all that we saw. It's still very new. These are the first analyses because of the volume of work. When we were working over the last few months, we thought, well, wonderful, we will have materials to produce studies and papers for the next 10 or 20 years. The need to consolidate the interpretation is because it's a very recent, topic.
Com o tempo super apertado, mas tinha uma
We
manifestação
have
já pedida
very
também.
little
Com essa, a
time,
gente
but
fecha a nossa
we
sessão.
had one
Infelizmente, vai ter que
question
fechar por
coming
causa do horário.
from the audience, and unfortunately, we have
Podemos
to
mais um
stop
pouquinho? Então tá bom.
because
Então temos
of
mais
the
duas pessoas.
time. So
Isso.
actually, we have two
Quatro
questions.
pessoas.
Four
Ok.
questions, okay.
Então eu peço que sejam bem breves, porque temos 4 manifestações.
So
nós estamos
please,
celebrando.
I ask you to be very short because we are really pressed for time.
Mais perto, por favor. Isso, mais perto.
Bom,
Ótimo.
primeiro bom dia ainda,
Okay.
né? Não, já é boa tarde a todas as pessoas.
Good
Eu queria
afternoon,
primeiro
everyone.
parabenizar a mesa,
First of
trabalho
all, I
Houve um
would
pedido
like
de
to
interromper um pouquinho. Houve um pedido para vocês
congratulate
olharem para a câmera quando fossem falar.
the
Quem está assistindo online, importante.
the
Hã?
panel. Well, people
Os
online
trabalhos
asked
super
you to look at the
instigantes,
camera.
não tava
Well, all the
forçando, né?
papers
Você
were
viu,
really
né, para poder
intriguing.
falar. Bom, eu vou
I
começar
really wanted to
pegando a
speak.
provocação para
I
Regina,
will
né?
start by
Você fez
asking
caminho
Regina.
metodológico que você
You
escolheu,
chose a
pelo
methodological track,
Mas aí eu vou te provocar por que você não
starting
começou
from
pelos
the
estatutos,
civil law,
né? O
and
estatuto
I
da
will
pessoa
ask you,
idosa, da
why
criança, do
didn't you
idoso,
start
do
from the
adolescente.
statutes? We
Porque
have
aí eu entendo o
statutes
seu caminho
for
metodológico, que você está
children,
focada no
adolescents,
mas outro
and
caminho é você
the
trabalhar
elderly.
na,
And I
focar no
understand
público
that you
beneficiário.
are
Eu posso falar do estatuto da pessoa idosa,
working
né?
based on care, and I can talk
Para mim,
about
a minha
the
leitura,
statute
que ali
for
ele apresenta uma
the
legislação
elderly, and it's a kind of
punitivista,
legislation
tá?
that
Ele
is
criminaliza o não
punishable,
cumprimento dos direitos legais. Né? E
and
tem
it
coisas assim
criminalizes
que,
the
para mim, são absolutamente
unfulfills
obriga
the
o familiar responsável a uma visita
legal
quinzenal nas ILPIs e tem, inclusive, livro de
duties.
receita que, se você for visitar seu
And
pai,
I think
você
it's
tem que assinar. Você pode
absolutely
assinar e assinar
absurd.
tudo
It
que pede,
obliges
né?
the
Tem casos
family
como o pai
member
abandonou a
that
família,
is
a filha de
responsible
16 anos, caso
for
concedido no conselho de idoso,
the
com 6
parent,
anos.
for
Quando ele já
instance,
estava com
and they
60 e
have
poucos,
to
morando num
be
banco de Copacabana,
visiting
o Ministério
the
pegou,
place
tá?
where the
Então, se ele tinha
elderly
família, ele falou que
person
tinha filha,
is
e aí a filha foi
every
obrigada a
15 days.
cuidar.
So I
Na
saw
verdade,
the
não foi a
case
filha,
of a
foi a mãe,
woman
né?
who was
Enfim,
abandoned by her
então,
father
o que
when
eu
she was
queria
6 years
colocar,
old, and when
né?
he was
E aí vai
60,
para Laura também,
he was
porque quando
collected
você
by the
coloca,
government,
né,
by the
a questão
state,
do
to
direito ao cuidado,
live
para cuidar,
in
para
a
cuidar,
public,
por que não o
in
direito
a
a não
state
cuidar?
shelter,
Bem, ou a
um,
não ser
and they
cuidado.
require the
Porque o
daughter
estatuto
to
fala,
visit him every 15 days.
ele fala, primeiro,
So there is a
artigo
right
direito
to
tem total
care.
liberdade,
How
Mas lá
about
na
the
frente
right
ele fala
not to care, not to be cared for?
Cara, como é que
And
liberdade?
they talk
Mas eu sou
about
obrigado a tomar banho?
self-negligence
Então,
is
isso,
a
eu acho
crime.
que
So
isso aí que
how
eu
can I
gostaria,
say I'm
né, de ver
free
mais
if I have
discutidos,
to take
né, por falar da
showers, for
legislação brasileira,
instance?
que
And I would like
essa
to
obrigação do
see
cuidado, não
those
só a
things
obrigação, como a
discussed
punição,
in
porque o
Brazilian
próprio estatuto diz.
legislation, which is
Se
the
você não cumpre as
duty
sanções, você
to
é
care
criminalizado.
and
Nesse
the
caso,
punishment
quem é
when you don't
criminalizado
care.
é
And
o
in this
idoso,
case,
não é
the
o
people
idoso,
who are
não é o Estado,
punished
se
or
não tem bem
criminalized in the
para ele.
case
Mas se a família
of the
não
elderly
busca
is
o
not the
idoso no hospital,
state, but
a
it's the
família é
family, you know, even though it would be a duty by the state to find a home for this elderly person.
Buenas tardes, digo, sí, creo que ya son
Good
tardes.
afternoon.
Vega y soy coautora con Carolina
I think
la
it's the
ponencia que
afternoon. I'm
presentó
Camila Vega. I'm the co-author together with Carolina
para,
of the
sumarme a lo que ellas ya
paper she
mencionaron sobre las
presented.
preguntas de Marcos.
And I would like to make a few comments to build up on what's been said in response to Marcos's questions. First of all, international law has a basic principle, which is interpretation must be evolving. It must adjust to the social changes and the realities that are faced, and it must be adjusted to the new ways of looking at the world. In the specific case of the American Convention on Human Rights, which is one of the important aspects because of the consulting opinion of the Inter-American Court, it is essential to take into account that the court recognized that the Inter-American Convention did not include a feminist perspective. Thus, they recognize that there are rights that are not clearly in the convention, but must be recognized as human rights, such as the right to truth, to a healthy environment. And in that realm, those rights existed, and they are useful in this context. The relation between care and migration, based on what Rochelle proposed with the global chains of care, we have the movements of the South going north to the north, and women who did performed care tasks so that other women can participate in the labor markets. And the women who migrated left their children in their original places and to be cared for by other people. We did a study with Carolina and Suelen talking about the global chains of care, thinking about the migration between Colombia and Venezuela. And that does not correspond to domestic care. When Venezuelan women come to Colombia, they don't always don't always do domestic work because that was performed by women who had been displaced internally. And thank you for the presentations.
Boa tarde a todas e todos. Eu não podia resistir de fazer breve comentário e algumas perguntas para essa mesa que
A brief comment and some questions to this panel. It is very important in the relation of the law on this panel with the women who are researchers and consolidated a specific addition to care in the sphere of law. This is very important and difficult to measure in an interdisciplinary debate as ours. In the field of law, that has the possibility of radically changing what we understand as people, relationship, public, private realms, and so on and so forth. It's not a casual thing. It's not a less important thing, even though Laura states that it's not a new law, a new right, excuse me, but the field is new. And we must form or design this field of analysis together with them. And Marcos, when Regina started training the robots, she's speaking about the robots. I was so scared that I left the study. This is why the communication between the first and second parts lacks a connection.
Now, there's something that came up in Ana Amelia's words, also showed up in our survey of literature, namely the inception of care as an obligation, as a duty, and a punitive aspect of duty. When associated rights with domestic workers were recognized, this was the first instance in which care was associated with rights. In other words, in a recent past, care was considered a demobilizer of rights. If you're doing care, you lose your rights, in other words. So since Laura has mentioned a positive agenda as care as a human rights was very important, but to this day there is an ongoing contradiction because of the strength of the punitive perspective, and approach is being very, very strong, especially from the point of view of legal courts. So my question to Laura is, how do we deal with this contradiction, which lies at the very foundation of the right to care, and which comes up in specific situations? For example, the current president of Argentina asked the International Court of Law to drop the consultation results, and the Inter-American Court of Law decided to maintain it. Thank you once again, an extraordinary debate. Good afternoon. We don't have much time, so I'll just make some questions, direct my questions to Regina, but I'd like to congratulate Laura and Carolina for their presentations. A very direct question. I'm going to read your observation on robots, and the most important aspect for me, which is labor. I'd like to know whether you were considering law number 150, whether this can be found in this law, and another question that has to do with fragmentation. It's a type of fragmentation that stems from the breadth of the concept of care itself, or is it something that you cannot avoid within law? Or from the labor point of view, the right of the person to care and the right of the person who is hired to provide such care. There can be a conflict of race in this situation, a conflict of class in this situation. So when you speak about fragmentation, I'd like to know whether within this concept, this fragmentation is somehow inevitable. If I right to be cared, this might naturally shock with the right of the person for better wages, let's say. So back to our panel for their last consideration. Thank you so much for the interest on my study. I'm going to answer very succinctly due to lack of time. Thank you, Camila, for your observations, and Pedro for your clarification. They're all very important. I'm going to reference the right to not deliver care. It's one of the dimensions which has not been analyzed to date, but it's always there in the background. When we speak about the exercise of rights, the right to exercise them, and that's when we speak about people, and when we consider structural inequalities. We shared information on the unfair gendered distribution of work regarding care. There is a specific problem that relates to that. We are not exercising our rights to self-care, to be cared, and to deliver care fully. Now, in the experiences we're sharing here, studies from France, the USA, and Canada, they have also shown us that the same happens in countries such as the USA who are not parties to several international agreements. In the specific case of elderly people, this is an extraordinary example. because self-care and the right to care and to receive care are absolutely central, for example, for elderly women who are left on their own and establish a routine of self-care because they have no one left to them, while in a couple, the man did not exercise any of these rights because he's always received care from women, and these women end up being elderly women on their own. So why don't we look at the issue of the right not to care? Because first we need to exercise the right, which is exercised when the distribution of rights happens. There is a lack of distributions in our region, and that is why it's so important to speak about cultural divides. The first to recognize this, the first group to recognize this are the women themselves who don't see their work neither as rights. And I really like the observation that was made in our in our Magnum conference, when we speak about the image of women and strike and the poster. If we ask any woman today, a woman who spent the whole day ironing clothes and doing domestic work, if if she later watched a series on TV, she'll only mention the series because she does not consider domestic work as work. So the right to be cared is a right that is only now being recognized. And so breaking this, the participation of men in the sphere, the cultural issues that relate to that, from that point on, the right to not care or to not deliver care. Men, for example, exercise this right on a daily basis. That's what happens.
Rapidamente, está todo mundo com fome?
Very quickly, everyone's hungry. Firstly, Pedro, thank you. Secondly, Ana Amélia and Luisa, I think your provocations are convergent. Pedro has answered them to a certain point, but this punitive approach is at the very heart of our critique that relates to fragmentation, to the fact that we to date are not able to consider this subject that has lived through many stages in their lives, who has to live with, let's say, this elderly parent who they are made to care for, and when they are made to suffer the legal consequences of not delivering care. But just from a methodological point of view, we do not start with the law itself, the regulation, because that's how the chambers are divided in our legal architecture. That's where this division stems from. But of course, as Marcos said, we need to deepen our analysis, and this is something we plan to do, including these perspectives. As for Luisa, answering your question, yes, the complementary law number 150 is mobilized. We do work with decisions before that law, but most of them come after that. So even though the worker self-identifies as a domestic worker, care of children, care of elderly, she is considered within the context of law 150. So some cases in which people self-identify as a carer but a cleaner, a carer but a cook as well. So these debates always happen, but always based on the tenets of law number 150. As regards your provocation, whether this fragmentation is inevitable or whether it is avoidable, our critique is not regards the social, so to say, opposition. If we look at caste conflict, class conflict within the workforce, the critique here regards to the subject. Brazil, a good example, Mithis, the mother of Miguel. She was never considered a subject with her own rights who needed to work during the pandemic. She needed to earn her living and someone who needed care. So what did she need to do? She needed to move to her employer's home, bringing her child. So you need to understand this person in its entirety, or the relation between life and work, or however the ILO wishes to consider that. But when we consider this fragmented approach, does not recognize their laws. So for Merity's case, there were several incidents, legal rulings, but labor rulings were never considered. She is a carer within work. The mother is outside the factory, as in the image we saw. That's the very heart of our critique. Marcos? So just say a few words about architecture, framework architectonics. This comes from philosophy. We speak about architectonics of reason and not architecture of reason. Why? Because of what Camila mentioned, there is an evolution. When you speak about architecture, you have a static image and nothing that includes the need for evolution. Architectonics considers resolution of conflicts, and not delivering care is a conflict that is happening today, something we must deal with and bring in the fold. That's why I chose that term. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Thank you for this amazing panel. Thank you for everyone who asked questions, and I'd invite Nadia to make her closing remarks.
Também estou animadíssima com a mesa.
I'm so excited with this panel. We really let go of time because we wanted to go in depth. Yesterday, some sessions we did not have the time to do that, but I just wanted to call your attention that we will be back strictly at 2:30. We realigned our agenda last night with the interpretation team, with the transmission teams. Thank heavens now things are working just fine. We are having to deal with delays rather comfortably, but we cannot rest on our laurels. We can't be that comfortable. So we need to be back at 2:30 sharp. And the posters, which were the hit of our day, will still be there. Thank you. What a wonderful panel. Thank you so much.